everybody. Hope you're all well, and anyone who's joining from WA, I think it's bright and early, but not too early, which is good. So before Richard gets started, I'd like to just quickly acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and for me personally, I'd particularly like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people from whose lands I'm dialing in from today, and extend that to all the peoples whose lands you're joining from today as well. I'd like to express my respect for any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us in today's training, and express my appreciation for the ongoing stewardship of country that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have practiced for thousands of years. And we understand that we all have much to learn from traditional ways of knowing, being, and doing. So start with that. And then just wanted to welcome you all to the first carbon neutral agriculture course session. My name is Zoe Booker, and I work in the Commonwealth Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, DQ, on the Carbon Farming Outreach Program. Also here with me, Hayley Lambert, joining the call today. So she's going to join as an observer today, just for this session, and I'll join on Wednesday. And just to reiterate again that the session's intended to provide supplementary information to support you in delivering the Carbon Farming Outreach Program in your community, and it'll help dive deeper into the more technical aspects of carbon farming and provide further information to support you in delivering. Today's session, which I'm sure Richard will get into, is focused on cropping, and there's also invitations for beef and horticulture specific. For this session, it'll focus on the science behind greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, with a particular focus for cropping, methods for measuring these emissions, and different opportunities to reduce emissions and store carbon. It's not an expectation today that trainers need to walk out with a deep technical understanding of the content that is presented. The intent of the sessions is to give you further information, tools, and knowledge to continue to provide guidance and support in your communities. And of course, these sessions are optional and not mandatory. I'll just quickly finish off with that on top of these carbon neutral ag sessions, we're also offering a suite of webinars for grantees to be involved in over the next 2 months. We'll send links to these out to you all shortly via your grantee leads, but we've got one on the 11th of February and another on the 27th of February, both being presented by Richard. First one on the 11th is about what's driving carbon farming and why knowing about it is good for farm business. And then the one on the 27th is on carbon calculators and sort of the ins and outs of that. And the third one, the date's still TBC, but it'll probably be the end of March, focused on cultural burning. And again, I'll just send them out in an email, so you don't have to, commit those to memory, but they're also here to support you as well to deliver the CFOP. So thank you for listening, and hope you enjoy today's session. I'll hand it back to Richard.
Thanks, Zoe. And hi, everyone. Richard Eckard here from the University of Melbourne. I'm also now with the Net Zero Agriculture CRC. Given that there's probably now about 25 that we would expect online, probably take too long to go through introductions, but as a kind of macabre sense of fun, maybe just post what your maximum temperature is going to be at your location so that we get the chat flowing. I think it's going to be 38 here today. So I've got a fan on me from the side here just to keep things moderate. We'll get into it as we go through. This is a one-day version of our carbon neutral agriculture training course that we've been running from the University of Melbourne. And as Zoe was saying, this one is more focused on cropping industries. So the program you see online here, welcome introductions, industry and market drivers. In other words, who's asking for low emissions? Where's that coming from? And as Zoe was saying, those of you who heard that section from me before, there's quite a lot of update there because I've borrowed content from this new webinar we're doing in a few weeks' time. So there's a lot more happening in the whole industry market driver side of things. And so then we deal with greenhouse gas emissions, go on to carbon farming, carbon accounting, carbon neutral agriculture. Then the way we run these is when it's the livestock focused one, we spend more time on methane. When it's the nitrous oxides focus of cropping, we spend more time on nitrous oxide. That's really the essential difference, apart from the fact that I pick case studies as I go through that are more grains or cropping relevant or horticulture relevant for the horticulture section or livestock relevant. So that's why the program just says look onto the right and see that when it's a livestock session, methane will be the focus, and we'll just do a short section on nitrous oxide, whereas today we're going to spend probably 10, 15 minutes on methane just to give you a high-level overview, and then go into the more detailed on nitrous oxide. Yeah, so the irony is it's cooler further north, it seems, 26 degrees in Toowoomba, and Melbourne's going to be 38. So there you go. You never predict what the weather's going to do in Australia. So then we'll take a bit of a break, and after lunch, the lunch break can come anywhere really. Some of these sessions might flow over a bit, but the aim is to get to sort of the end of the Trees on Farm project somewhere around 3 o'clock, and then have a Q&A session. But because there's 25 of us, we might be able to do a lot of the Q&A as we go through. So let's keep that in mind. But don't be shy about posting your questions. All right, ready to go. Just making sure that there's no questions in the chat box. It's all just temperatures that are all high or high. So industry and market drivers. I like to start with this as to who's asking, because when you stand in front of a group of farmers and they want to know why should we care, I find I've got to be ready for that. I've got to be able to answer where's this coming from. And while you could point to earlier statements around reducing emissions, I started the COP21 Paris Agreement, where it was the first time there was a global agreement between all countries participating that we need to get to net zero by 2050. In other words, a balance between greenhouse gas emissions and removals in some form of sequestration by 2050. And all that happened at subsequent agreements like the COP26 Glasgow was there was increased short-term ambition. In other words, don't wait until 2050 to tell us what you're going to do to get to net zero. Tell us what you're going to achieve by 2030. And that's where Australia set a 43% by 2030, net zero by 2050 target. So that set the ball in motion. I like to throw this out just because a lot of farmers say we're getting buried in reporting. And I did a quick Google search on multinational sustainability reporting frameworks, and this is what came up, this montage. So if you're Rabobank or you're Coles or you are Olam or Cargill, this is the montage of reporting that you face. Now, fortunately, there's a few of us that our task is to distill that down to what is relevant to our supply chain. And you could really boil it down to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, climate-related financial disclosures, and international financial reporting standards. So those ones sort of towards the left. The rest all feed into that framework. But that's not what we're talking about today. Let's go through a sequence now of who's facing what, and we'll start with companies, and then we'll take it down from there. So why do companies face mandatory reporting? Well, because companies in the world, 100 of the largest companies in the world are responsible for 70% of all the world's industrial greenhouse gas emissions. That's not agricultural or land-based emissions. So companies do need to take responsibility. And so I've just given you a sequence of the various projects, SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, EU Sustainability Reporting Directive, California's disclosure, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, which one could argue that might not exist after the recent new president. But you can see a large number of companies around the world are now being covered by mandatory reporting or by certain targets. SBTI, science-based targets, is voluntary. Carbon Disclosure Project is not. EU Sustainability Reporting Directive is not. The California one is not. So there's a series of those. And you can see how this has been playing out in the agricultural value chain. I talk of value chain because we say supply chain, but then that doesn't cover the banks and then the insurance. So value chain to me covers the banks, insurance companies, anything that supplies services to the agricultural sector. And you can see here just a smattering of different multinational companies, dairy companies, Heineken, the banks, all having set targets towards net zero by 2050. And you could probably say, once you've analyzed a couple of pages of this information, there's an average of about a 30% reduction in emissions intensity set by the agricultural supply chain due by 2030, and then net zero by 2050. Whether they get there or not is not the question here, because a lot of people have said, oh, well, they'll never get there. That's not the point. The point is the target is there, and they have set it using the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So we know that that's happening. Now, in terms of countries and mandatory reporting, we see the International Financial Reporting Standards now, which includes S2, which is climate-related disclosure standard, having been set in a number of countries. So in Australia, it includes the Sustainability Reporting Standard for climate-related disclosures. And this automatically then affects more than 100,000 companies globally. Now, where it comes into agricultural relevance is a lot of this has got a phased-in reporting of Scope 3. We'll deal with that in a moment, what Scope 3 is. But that basically means if any of these companies have agriculture in their supply chain, that includes their Scope 3 reporting. So New Zealand agriculture, for example, is captured in New Zealand's commitment to mandatory reporting. In Australia, we've seen the Treasury Laws Act of 2024 Amendment Act, which is a framework for climate-related financial disclosures, and will phase in Scope 3 for agricultural supply chains by 2027. And this is something I'm involved in. We made an appeal to government, the minister at the time, saying, well, if there is going to be mandatory reporting, we need the Bible on mandatory reporting. In other words, what does the methodology look like so that we don't have different greenhouse gas accounting tools giving different numbers? We need one methodology, and then the only question you ask is, does this greenhouse gas accounting tool align with the voluntary emission reporting standard that government has developed? So that process is now well underway. They've had 3 reference group meetings already with consultation with the value chain. And the process is co-chaired between the government and the Net Zero Agriculture CRC. This is just out of the Treasury document. You'll see this table of the phase-in of reporting under the Australian legal framework. The only change that Zoe pointed out to me is if you're looking at the original PDF that I've got linked at the bottom there, it did say July 24 for the first group, but that's now changed to January 25. So it starts with big companies, any company over 500 million or more, or gross assets of over $1 billion. But it phases then down to cover by 2027, 50 million or more as a company, which will have a flow onto agriculture as a Scope 3 supplier. Now, if we see how this then plays out, we see multinational supply chains either covered by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is a voluntary code, but it does relate to the International Financial Reporting Standards as a methodology. And why are they doing this? Well, it's about shareholder risk. In other words, it's managing the shareholders, the predicted future trends of customers. Because you would argue right now, if you do a survey of customers at Tesco in the UK, they would say we like climate carbon neutral product, but when they buy, they're buying on price. But this is all predicated on future customer trends and shareholder risk. And we find the multinational and central banks and insurers are also just aiming to manage shareholder risk. So it brings me to need to explain so that it's clear in everybody's mind, what do we mean by scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? Now, I've got two slides here. One that says understanding it from a farm point of view, and then another one trying to explain what it means from the supply chain or value chain point of view. So a scope 1, 2, and 3 are not necessarily the same thing. It depends on who you are. So just follow me through this. If you were a farm, your scope 1 emissions are the direct greenhouse gas emissions from your animals, methane from your animals, nitrous oxide from urine and urea, fertilizer use, carbon dioxide from the use of lime or diesel consumption on farm. Your scope 2 is indirect emissions that occur elsewhere in the Latrobe Valley or the Hunter River Valley, but they occur because you draw power out of the electricity grid. So you can imagine if you're in Central Australia, there'd be almost negligible emissions on most of our extensive rangeland systems because they would have scope 1 emissions for generating power from diesel generators because they're not drawing out of the grid. Then you've got scope 3. Scope 3 emissions are indirect emissions that occur either before or after the farm. This would be the energy embedded in manufacturing urea, for example. Significant energy is required to make urea fertilizer. Someone has to take responsibility for that, and it goes to the farm because this year you would cop it. Next year you would phone up your fertilizer supplier and say, can you supply me with low emissions urea? And you think that might not be happening, but it is. One of our big companies, CSBP in Western Australia, is deliberately buying low emissions urea from Canada rather than buying high emissions urea from China. So those kind of things are starting to happen already, and it's only because it is an imperative in the supply chain to reduce those emissions that we're seeing some action take place. So one would expect that over time, farmers through their buying power can reduce those scope 3 emissions just by phoning up their supply chain and say, have you got carbon neutral glyphosate for me? Have you got carbon neutral urea? What can you supply? Now let's switch it around. When it comes to the supply chain or your bank, your value chain, their scope 1 emissions are negligible. It's the ute that they use to drive up your driveway to the farm. So not a lot of scope 1 emissions. Their scope 2 emissions are the same as the farmer. If they turn on the lights in the office in downtown Brisbane, well, that incurs an emission that occurs maybe away from the city at the power station, but it occurs because they turn on the lights. So not a big source either. But here's the real kicker, is the scope 3 emissions of your bank, of your value chain, of your grain marketing board. That scope emission is the farm. It is the emissions from the farmers that supply product down the supply chain. And so we've been doing a lot of work with the banks, for example, trying to get a handle on what is their exposure in their loan portfolio of the money they're lending to farmers. And they want to know, well, what's the average emission from the precision ag croppers in Western New South Wales or in Geraldton? So that's the kind of information they needing to report on. Now, when it comes to understanding targets, it's quite important to understand there are two separate types of targets going here. There's absolute targets and there's relative targets. Now, on the left-hand side, I'll bring out the right-hand side in a moment, but on the left-hand side, we start with absolute targets, which is greenhouse gas emissions per unit area or per country or per state or per business unit. That's absolute emissions. And this is typically what Australia reports on to the UNFCCC. The Australian Greenhouse Gas Inventory is an inventory at a state level, at an industry level, or at a country level. And this is where the target, if you look around the world, their typical country targets of 30 to 40% by 2030. Australia is 43% specifically, but net zero by 2050. So you can see these could include countries, but also industry strategies like the red meat target of CN30, carbon neutral by 2030 in the red meat supply chain. Now let's flip it around and say, well, what is the target of the value chain? If you think of the value chain, if you think of a grain buyer, they can only buy on the basis of mass of grain, tons of grain that come into the silos, tons of grain that go down the supply chain. If you're a wool buyer, you buy on mass. If you're a dairy buyer, you buy on kilograms of milk solids. So their target, if you are a major dairy company or your major grain supplier, or bought malt or any of those, they can only, their target has to be on the basis of what they buy, because the less they buy greenhouse gas emissions per unit mass, the more they reach their target. Now, this is really important because it actually introduces a different target for the farmers supplying them who want to meet supply chain targets compared to national targets. Typically, there's also this 30% by 2030 that you saw on that earlier slide I showed you. But these are agricultural supply chains, and it's if you think of it as a ratio, it's tons of greenhouse gas emissions per ton of product. So it introduces a different metric that farmers can look at, which is an efficiency metric, which is how do we reduce greenhouse gases? That's one story. You can do that by reducing the amount of nitrogen fertilizer you use or buying from a different supplier. But how do you change the tonnage? Well, you could be more efficient at using that nitrogen fertilizer and producing more grain per unit nitrogen. That's classical nitrogen use efficiency. Now, I'm using a livestock example here, but I think this is the most pertinent one. The Farm Animal Investment Risk and Return Report was published in 2018 for the first time. Now, this is what's happening at the shareholder level globally, which is why these multinational companies are so concerned. And what this report does, it's a report to advise institutional investors in the London and New York Stock Exchange on the risks of investing in livestock agriculture based on their greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see Fonterra, a dairy company based in New Zealand, largely on the good side, looking good because they invest millions of dollars in research on methane in New Zealand. Ingham's, one of our poultry organizations, somewhere in the middle. Poultry don't produce a lot of greenhouse gases. But at the time, and this is public knowledge, so I work a lot with AACO, but Australian Agricultural Company, one of our largest livestock companies, ranked number 7 worst in the world. Suddenly it did matter. And so we worked a lot with AACO in getting greenhouse gas audits in place. We worked a lot with AACO in getting them involved in carbon farming methodology. And guess what? The next report comes out. Fonterra is still where it was. Ingham's still where it was, but suddenly AACO, one of our largest livestock companies, has suddenly shifted up the list quite substantially. So this matters, particularly to the larger corporates. So what we've seen is a number of institutions making some strategic changes. We've seen the Australian red meat industry set a target of carbon neutral by 2030. Very bold, but it has struck a chord on the global stage. Whether we will get there or not is a different story. It's very difficult, put it that way. It's a very ambitious target. But why did they do that? Well, other jurisdictions around the world have done something similar. So we've seen the carbon neutral initiative in Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil includes livestock. We've seen the New Zealand Climate Change Response Act set targets for methane in New Zealand. Very controversial because something like 28% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in New Zealand is from livestock methane. So massive. There's no other country with that kind of profile where one company is responsible for so much greenhouse gas emissions of the agricultural supply chain. California has set a target, the methane short-lived climate pollutants bill. Now, just an anecdote, you've got to be careful as a politician because you could argue that some political change in New Zealand could be attributed to the methane tax. You could argue some political change in the Netherlands could be to do with the destocking policy. Um, you've seen in California, some of the big feedlots just move across the border into Arizona to get away from the methane tax. So we've got to be smart about how we do this. But 159 countries have all signed the Global Methane Pledge, um, which commits us to 30% less methane by 2030 by 159 countries. Yeah, Belinda, a very interesting question. What happens if the red meat industry in Australia doesn't meet their target? Just between us all on the call, it's unlikely they will. It was an aspirational target, and I've got it in another presentation that when it was announced by Richard, I forget his surname at the time, it was announced at the AGM in Alice Springs. And there were three caveats about significant investment, significant policy position support, none of which came about. So actually, the fact that they've got as far as they have is nothing short of amazing. So I suspect over time what happens is we forget the caveats that were in place at the time. And we just say, well, they're not going to get there. Well, rather than say, well, the three caveats that they had didn't come about. They've leveraged about a quarter of the investment they had targeted. The policy environment for the next decade didn't come into line for them. So yeah, look, it's an aspirational target, not a mandatory target. So that probably doesn't answer your question. But we have seen a number of carbon neutral product claims. I've given you two contrasting examples here. One from the livestock industries, just a quick web search, you'll find these. And one from the wine industry. Now, much easier for the wine industry because 90% or more of their emissions is from energy. So if they go onto renewable energy and renewable fuels, you could say most wineries would be 90% carbon neutral because most of it comes from bottle washing and bottle making. Whereas livestock, it's quite tricky. I mean, the NAPCO 5 founders most of them have to just buy offsets on the meat, which doesn't really change any of the methane produced by the animals. Now, some important caveats here about understanding there's a growing awareness by institutional investors, like the banks, that there is a fundamental difference between types of carbon and types of reductions. Sequestration or drawdown, where you take carbon, you store it in wood, you store it in soils, even geosequestration. The law of diminishing returns is a universal law that I'll come to later in the day. It basically means you can't do this indefinitely. There will come a point where the trees grow up and no longer grow. A black wattle only grows for 20 years and then it levels off and dies. A eucalyptus spotted gum might actually grow for 80 years and then it curves off and stables out. But the day of reckoning does come, and the Jigsaw Farms example I'll show you later shows you hard data on this happening in both their soils and their trees. So it does mean that you've got this reserve, this reservoir, this bank account, and you can build it up to a point. But if you sell it to a mining organization, it's gone out of your thumb. But the fact that you've sold it, but it's still actually physically sitting there means you can't repeat the performance. You can't double it again. The diminishing return says it's a finite resource. And then there is still the risk of reversal in fire, flood, and I'll get to that later in the day. As opposed to emissions avoidance, which is actually what we should be focused on, if you put on less nitrogen fertilizer or you put on a coated fertilizer onto a crop and just didn't emit the nitrous oxide, that's repeatable every year. You can repeat that the next nitrogen application, the next year you can do the same thing again. So that emission reduction is repeatable indefinitely. And you can sell those indefinitely. If there was an offset method associated with the reduction of nitrogen in cotton, for example, those reductions can be sold right up until the day that your supply chain might actually want you to socialize that with them rather than actually generate cash out of it. So there's no risk of reversal because it didn't happen. And there's no permanence test, no permanence obligation. It doesn't go on the title, it doesn't transfer with the property. So very different in terms of risk profile by the investors, and they're starting to cotton on to that. Now, inevitably, uh, the down at the bottom, I say definitions by myself. This is because I'm introducing a bit on offsetting versus insetting. I won't spend much time on it, but it's worth touching on. But a disclaimer from the Commonwealth side is the Australian government doesn't have a policy position on this. So this is not Australian policy. It's just my interpretation of what's happening in the industry. So you can offset, which is buying or cancelling or retiring of carbon credits by an organization to compensate for the emissions it produces. So the big mining giants right now have to face emission reduction under the safeguard mechanism. And they're coming to the land sector to say, can we buy carbon credits to retire against our obligation? Insetting is probably an incorrect term, strictly speaking, but you could think of it as instead of selling it outside of the farm, you're socializing it within your value chain family. In other words, that page I showed you of the emission reduction that Olam and Cargill and Boart Malt are all seeking, how are they ever going to get there unless the farm sells it to them? So it's activities that reduce or avoid emissions within the value chain and counts towards emission reduction or carbon storage towards the operation's total emissions. Probably best described as socializing your low carbon footprint. Now, if you think about that page I showed you of the supply chain targets, the day they set those targets, they assumed insetting. They didn't know it at the time, but they did, because if all the farmers sold their emissions, the reduction to the mining industry, the supply chain has no chance of ever getting anywhere towards their targets. So insetting was born the moment they set those targets. And the worst outcome for your bank or your supply chain is that you sell carbon credits outside of the family, because then they'll never get to their target. We have some insights into what this business model might look like, and I'll just present it quickly and then we'll move on to the rest of the talk. If you think about it, who wants a slice of your carbon as a farm? It's your value chain. It's your bank, your processor, your downstream, your consultancy group. And on the top right, you've got your emissions intensity figure. So if you're prime lamb, you could be a 6 rather than a 10. If you're a grain farm, you could be a 0.15. If you're in low rainfall Western Australia using modest amounts of nitrogen, you're probably a 1.15. If you're in high rainfall Rutherglen in northeast Victoria, you're probably a 0.5, just because of higher nitrogen use and lower nitrogen use. Now, if you are a buyer and you have a target, why would you buy from the right-hand side of the diagram? You would buy on the left side, because the more you buy on the left, the less carbon credits you need to buy to get to your stated target. If you only buy from the right, you kind of sink yourself in getting to your own target. Question is who pays, because that carbon is worth $35 per carbon credit. So there's a counterfactual. If you did have a reduction in emissions that could be monetized, or carbon sequestration in the soils that could be monetized, you could sell it. So it's not valueless to the farmer. And there's an emerging solution that we're working on in a number of industries around what we call the supply shed concept. It's turning out to be quite big with groups like Nutrien, SustainCert in the United States. And it's basically a virtual cooperative where farmers get together with their value chain and sort it out. And just that discussion hasn't happened much in Australia yet. So we're getting a red meat group together, a dairy group together, a grains group together, a cotton group together to have this conversation about, well, what can each of you offer the farmer who's got this emission reduction to offer? Be socialized within that supply chain, and what does it come to when everyone puts in a small amount of their value into that supply shed? So watch this space. This is rapidly emerging, but it certainly isn't in the market just yet. I'll probably end this section just with a cautionary tale about the future ESG market. This is something we did with the Australian Farm Institute and the National Farmers Federation, and I contributed to a number of these modules in the Australian Agriculture Sustainability Framework. What I point you to is currently there's a real strong focus on greenhouse gas emissions and air quality, and a bit on soils as well. So P1, P2, P3, P4. But look at what comes next. Look where the arrows are pointing. So we're on notice that by 2030, we'll be doing carbon, and biodiversity will be the next big thing. And water use efficiency will be the next big thing. So I guess what I'm saying is when we're talking to farmers, they need to be aware that they shouldn't be doing things for carbon that lock themselves out of biodiversity in future. We need to keep both in mind. I mention this because if you look across the ditch in New Zealand, they're planting pine trees in sheep pastures because it's the quickest return on carbon credits from that hectare of sheep pasture. But guess what? When you get to 2030 and biodiversity is also a criteria, well, pine doesn't give you much. So we've got to be careful about looking at the big picture at all times. I'll keep moving on the basis that I'm looking at the meeting chat to see if anyone's posting any questions. So please feel free to keep posting questions in the chat. There's a short section now on Australian carbon crediting policy, and we'll just go straight into it. I deliberately keep this short because in the online module of CFOP, there was a fair bit on Australian carbon credit scheme. So what we know is the original Act 2011 started with the Carbon Farming Initiative. It's now migrated to the Australian, it used to be the Emission Reduction Fund and is now the Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme. Policy always emerges as time goes on, so just keep in mind why it is called the Carbon Credits Act. Which means that carbon credits can be allocated for reducing emissions or increasing carbon stored in soils and vegetation. But it has to be against a known methodology or a registered protocol. Now, who manages aspects of this scheme? This was useful for me to sort of break this out so it was clear in my mind who you should talk to about what aspects of the scheme. The Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water is responsible for the policy development, for the legislation, for the oversight, for the science behind the methodologies and that can create ACCUs. After the Chubb review, there was a separation of powers where all that used to be with the Clean Energy Regulator, but you can't have all within one agency. So they are now the administrator of the scheme, independent statute authority to administer the ACCUs, project compliance and oversight. So if you have a concern about the science integrity, don't go to the CER, you've got to go to the department. If you have something about abatement contracts or the protocols involved and how they are being implemented, go to the Clean Energy Regulator. And then separate to that, and this is a very important part of the scheme, it's something that doesn't happen in the voluntary market, and it's quite there's a strong call out of the latest COP meeting for this to be locked down globally. The Australian National Registry of Emissions Unit tracks every single Australian carbon credit unit. They have a unique identifier on them. And if I sell mine to Greg, for example, we have to register the transfer of ownership with the ANREU. Really important that you can't double sell an Australian carbon credit unit. It's a serious problem in the voluntary market where we've approached them and they've said it's not within our business interest to have unique identifiers on our carbon credits. And that means you can sell soil carbon 3 different ways on global markets if you wanted to, without them reconciling with each other. That makes a mockery of trading carbon. So tracking ownership is actually part of the integrity of the Australian scheme. Just to give you an idea, there's a web link down the bottom, which you'll get in the notes, tells you where all the carbon projects are. You could probably argue the higher rainfall regions have got some of the more intensive agricultural methods or energy methods, whereas the more you go to the extensive area in Central Australia, there'd be more human-induced regeneration, Western Queensland, human-induced regeneration, in Northern Australia, more savanna burning methodologies. So that would be logical. Now, under what used to be the Emission Reduction Fund, there were a series of reverse auctions where government was buying Australian carbon credit units. That finally ended with the final auction in March 2023 when the private sector and private trading just really took over. So there's no point in the Australian government actually buying emission reduction when trading is occurring at a larger volume within the commercial sector. This just gives you some idea of where all the activity is. That's the reason why I'm showing you, not because of how much the Australian government has purchased, but more to show the top row is where all the activity is. And this is part of the unfortunate side of a voluntary scheme. If you think of where the emissions come from, they come from the bottom row: energy, facilities, industrial, transport, whereas most of the action has actually been in the vegetation and landfill sectors, and then less in agriculture and savanna fire management. So there's a need for the safeguard mechanism which captures the bottom row. That was the whole purpose of the safeguard mechanism. And so what had to happen is you couldn't have a scheme where you're actually issuing carbon credits where you don't cap the big end of town's emissions. Otherwise, you could issue carbon credits and still increase in emissions. So the safeguard covers the big emitters in the economy, everything over 100,000 tons of emissions. And these are entities that are already report under the National Greenhouse Emissions Reporting Scheme, NGERS. So those blue bars would say, let's say that's a power station in the Latrobe Valley. And they take their 5 years of NGERS report over that period, and their baseline is set by the worst case scenario. So that's the horizontal dotted line, is the baseline. That's how it used to be under the previous government. But now the latest legislation under the current government is the red line, which says, well, in order to change behavior, you've got to push that down. You can't have it just horizontal, or else no one changes anything. It's status quo. So the red line pushes it down by 4.9% per year, making it harder and harder for businesses to just stay under the line or buy carbon credits. Now, the reason why I mention this, because this is effectively a baseline and credit market mechanism, which is a fairly efficient mechanism because the entities that exceed that red line have to remit carbon credits for the degree by which they exceed the line. In other words, this particular scenario here with the fifth blue bar above the line, they would have to pay the penalty or reduce their emissions. Now, I mention this to you not because it's something you'd have to manage, but you can understand why there is a demand from the big emitters, the big mining giants, the big power stations, to buy carbon credits out of the land sector. And increasingly, there's going to be increasing demand to buy these carbon credits. So the demand will always be there for ACCUs. This is a summary I did at the end of January of the status of the carbon market, the ACCUs issued, where you can see a bunch of methodologies. So I've got them in categories from agriculture and then manure management, and all the previous names of the methodologies that have now been consolidated into less. So there used to be one just for piggeries, one just for dairy, and they've been consolidated into the animal effluent methodology and the total number of credits issued. Beef nitrate methodology, there's been no uptake of that. It's just more expensive to feed nitrate to the cattle in Northern Australia than it is to the reward for the methane. The beef herd methodology, the large corporates have taken it up quite well. Unfortunately, no uptake of the fertilizer efficiency method. We wrote that method on the idea that it would create a precedent where we could then translate that to other industries and merge that into coated fertilizer methodologies. Neither of those happened, but there is a lot of move in that area to sort of go towards coated fertilizer. I'll deal with that soon. Soil carbon, there's been a lot of enthusiasm in soil carbon. Probably worth mentioning that even though there's over 700 projects on soil carbon, the total amount of ACCUs issued for soil carbon is still less than 1% of the total ACCUs issued. So a lot of potential, but not a lot of reality just yet. Savanna fire management has been a very attractive method, simply because it makes sense from multiple angles. Then total vegetation, I've taken all those methods on the left and added them up to the 84,000 to give you some idea of where the action's been relative to the agricultural sector. So that gives you some idea. Now, according to the government, and this is based on the original Clean Development Mechanism legislation out of the Kyoto Protocol originally, there had to be integrity standards to make sure Australian carbon credit units have integrity on the global stage. And this is where terminology like additional, beyond what is expected, it has to be additional to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It can't be business as usual. It has to be permanent. A time limit on permanence is an Australian construct. You don't find it outside of Australia. Permanent is permanent on global markets. Avoidance of leakage. In other words, you can't destock one property or put more nitrogen on one property and less on another property. On average, the atmosphere sees the same emissions. So that's called leakage. Has to be based on peer-reviewed science. That is really important because there's a lot of enthusiasm in this area, but not much of that is translating into the peer-reviewed literature at the rate that we would like. It must be measurable. Mustn't be inconsistent with the national greenhouse gas inventory approach to quantifying these. Inherently conservative. If the science says 70%, a methodology will never say 70. It will say something like 60% because of a conservative nature of overclaiming, and internationally consistent. So how are we doing? Everyone all right? If I keep going, I'm basically going until I get questions, and then we could break out into question time. But feel free to type any questions as we go. This is a fairly short section on greenhouse gas emissions, after which we'll take a quick 5-minute break and come back. If you look around the world, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are somewhere around 12 to 13, maybe 14%, depending on whose assessment you're looking at. Probably the big ones would be the IPCC. That's an old one, 2014, but it hasn't changed much. The World Resources Institute, a recent publication, and the US EPA is another one. Greg, let's go to that question quickly. Greg asked about the leakage concept. Leakage is basically if you've got, say, 2 properties and you decide I'm going to register a carbon methodology on my cotton property by reducing nitrogen fertilizer on this property to 100 kilos of nitrogen, but I'm going to go 300 on the rest of my property. Well, the atmosphere actually, and you get the same total yield as a result because the 300 grows what the 100 didn't grow. So you register a scheme, claim carbon credits for reducing emissions on the 100 kilo nitrogen property, and you get paid a carbon credit. Well, that's a false credit because the total emissions from both your properties averages what it would have been previously when you were putting on too much nitrogen. So same as stocking. You can't say, well, I'm going to reduce the number of animals on this property and I'm going to double them on the property next door and claim a carbon credit for reducing methane on the destocked property. The atmosphere sees the same. It can happen at a global level as well, where you say, well, there's a defined market for live export to Indonesia. And Australia can say, well, we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by sending less animals to Indonesia. All that would happen is Argentina or Brazil says, oh, we'll meet that market need. And the net result of total livestock emissions is the same around the globe as a result. So it can happen at a local level where what you do in one quarter is counterbalanced by something that you do that you don't tell anyone about elsewhere. That's classic leakage. You're actually leaking emissions out of the one system to the other, and the atmosphere doesn't get, probably stacking the books is a nice way to refer to it. That's probably a more accurate way of referring to it. You're stacking it so that your income remains the same. The atmosphere doesn't get the benefit, but you get a carbon credit from a quarter of your operation rather than holistically. This will come up later as well, Greg, in that one of the issues we're going to face in the future is You can have a carbon estimation area on two parts of your farm that are two different soil types and get a carbon credit on those two. When your supply chain wants to know your carbon from your farm, they don't allow you to segregate the farm into two separate areas. They want to know the whole farm. So if your farm's 1,000 hectares and you've got two carbon credit projects of 100 hectares each on the best soils, and you've ignored the rest of the farm, you can get paid a carbon credit for those carbon estimation areas. But when your supply chain, your bank wants to know the total emissions from your farm, they don't want to know the two separate areas. They want to know the whole soil of the whole farm. So currently you can stack the books by claiming from two separate carbon estimation areas and just ignore a potential loss on the rest, but not under an insetting model. You've got to declare the whole farm. That'll come up later. So hopefully that's a bit more clear, Greg. If you break down the inventory, obviously every country is different. And so this is a global picture of what's happening in agriculture. If you're in the United States, their agriculture is about 11%. If you're in New Zealand, agriculture is 49%. If you're in Brazil, agriculture is about 60%. If you're in Kenya, Kenya doesn't have an industrial power sector because it's all geothermal and hydro from the African Rift Valley. So Kenya doesn't have any industrial emissions to really speak about. So their agriculture is 60% of their emissions. In Australia, because we have a large energy sector and a large transport sector, agriculture is 17% of emissions. Now, here's a bit of a warning we issued quite a few years ago when agriculture was 14%, just about 2 years ago. If agriculture does nothing and the rest of the sector adopt renewable energy, agriculture automatically becomes more of the percentage. That's really important to understand. And what's happened here is agricultural emissions have not gone down for the last 2 years. Well, not significantly. But suddenly we've gone from 14 to 17% because the first two bars did go down. So proportionately, agriculture is now 17% of emissions in Australia. And where it comes from is mainly from enteric fermentation, about 11%. So this is the large number of sheep and cattle we've got on in Australia. To a lesser extent, nitrous oxide from agricultural soils, 3.3% of national emissions, and carbon dioxide from energy use from lime fertilizer production. So sorry, I had a bit of a delay there because I was looking at the 67 and 18. That's percentage of agricultural emissions. On the left, I've got methane 11% of national emissions and nitrous oxide 3% of national. So just in case there was confusion as to why there was an 18 and a 3.3. Breaking it down further now. So I've gone global, I've gone local, I've gone agriculture, and now I'm going into livestock and nitrous oxide. Livestock emissions is really just a function of animal numbers. So if you think we've got the greatest number of cattle, second largest number of sheep, and then dairy cattle third, just very much a function of livestock numbers. If you look at nitrous oxide, fertilizer use is the biggest target. And that's really a very large cropping industry that I'll come to in a moment. Organic fertilizer is not much. Don't forget that grazing animals produce urine, and urine is about 70% nitrogen in itself. So a large amount of nitrogen comes out in animal urine. Crop residues is a difficult one to explain sometimes because when you allow a residue to return in the wheat system, that dry wheat stover has about 2% nitrogen and 1.5 to 2% nitrogen. Over the whole of the wheat industry, that actually makes a large input of nitrogen back into the soil, and that is counted as an input of nitrogen, same as fertilizer would be going back into the soil, and that results in 20% of the nitrous oxide. Then separate to that, the last two columns are what we call indirect nitrous oxide, where some of the nitrogen you put on as urea is lost as ammonia, and it drifts around the district and comes down in rainfall and forms an input of nitrogen into the soil on your neighbor's farm. That results in indirect nitrous oxide from dry deposition or wet deposition. And leaching the same. Some of the nitrate in your farm would go through the soil, end up in some groundwater and be leaked out somewhere else in the landscape as indirect nitrous oxide. I'll deal with all these in more detail later as we break it down. But this brings us to a series of the farm calculators. So we've just used the greenhouse gas emissions calculators here, greenhouse gas framework, the GAF tools, and run many simulations across many farms, many case studies across many farms, and come up with some of those ranges at the top. So you could say the difference between rangeland beef and dairy is rangeland beef doesn't use nitrogen fertilizer. So it's mainly methane. Whereas the dairy industry uses a fair bit of nitrogen, which adds all those extra boxes in that you can see. But when you go to a grain system, look at the emissions intensity figures at the top, where grain doesn't have that large methane component, so proportionately much more conservative in emissions per ton of grain. Now, I do caution comparison between industries because I don't think it's actually particularly relevant. Look at poultry and pigs. There's not much methane from the actual animals themselves. So most of it is from manure management. Pigs mainly from manure management of methane. Poultry about equal from manure management, nitrous oxide and methane. So their options are around manure management, not around reducing emissions from the animals themselves. Look at cotton versus rice. Cotton is really heavily dependent on nitrogen fertilizer. So you've got pre-farm and on-farm nitrogen as the major contributors. Whereas rice, mainly about methane from flooding that field for so long. When we put together the rice calculator, we actually worked out with current practice, you don't need to flood the rice field until seed set, until anthesis development. And just doing that alone drops that methane 62% by 50% straight away with no loss of production. So there are options out there. It brings us to a page of emissions intensity comparisons. Now, you will struggle to find a page like this anywhere. This is just our experience in putting together multiple audits on multiple farms using the GAF tools, mainly working with some of the large banks across their client portfolios. It's desperately needed information because if you are an industry wanting to know what the average emissions are from a grain production system in Western New South Wales, well, I could tell you it would be about 0.35. But where would you find that officially so that you can say, well, am I better than the average? You would struggle to find that information. Now, I do caution the comparison between industries because a kilogram of chicken meat is not the same thing as a ton of wheat, which is not the same thing as a kilogram of milk solids, which is not the same thing as a ton of wool. That's a spurious comparison to make because they're not the same thing. But what you could do validly is look left to right and say, in a wheat system, what makes the difference between 0.1 and 0.5 emissions per ton of grain? What makes the difference between 0.5 and 0.75 per ton of canola? It's the efficiency of nitrogen fertilizer use. You can break it down to be that specific and say, on the left-hand side, you probably assume that 0.1 wheat is dryland wheat in low rainfall Western Australia, whereas the 0.5 is probably Northeast Victoria, 700 millimeters of rainfall and 200 kilos of grain, of nitrogen applied to grain. Why is canola generally higher than wheat? Probably because canola is generally grown in a slightly higher rainfall region and gets more nitrogen as a result. So Ananda asked, do we have any data from aquaculture emissions? We are in the process of building an aquaculture calculator. We just haven't finished it yet. It's going to be pretty small. And what we have found in the early looking at the aquaculture industry is there's no emissions from the fish farm itself, according to the inventory method. So most of their emissions are from the production of feed. So actually, turns out you could probably use our cropping calculator to generate an estimate of what the emissions are in feed production supplied to an agriculture operation, and then add the diesel and energy in, and you've almost got the entire calculation sitting there. That's what's coming out of the development of our aquaculture calculator. Going on to methane and nitrous oxide, one of the misnomers out there is, don't worry about methane, it's a short-lived gas and it's gone in 12 years. That's actually not true. 50% is gone. That's the half-life. Look at that graph on the right. After 12 years, half of the methane is gone. It's not the lifetime. The methane lifetime is more like 60 years before it's all gone. So it is still warming the atmosphere after 60 years as methane. The other problem is it's still warming the atmosphere 400 years later because the excess heat generated by methane being a more strident greenhouse gas, that heat goes somewhere. It goes into the deep ocean. And so the science actually says the heat load because of methane in the deep ocean will still be warming us in 400 years' time. So don't get sucked into methane being a short-lived gas. It's not relevant. What I've given you there is the IPCC fifth assessment report and the sixth assessment report and what they give for methane on a 20-year basis and a 100-year basis. The reason why I give you both is 27 is the latest number, but the Australian greenhouse gas inventory still uses the IPCC fifth assessment report value of 28. A lot of people also ask, is biogenic methane different to fossil methane? Greg, I'll come to your comment in a moment. And this is a relevant question because if it came from an animal, is it different to whether it came out of a coal seam? Turns out it's not actually that different because for the 60 years that methane's in the atmosphere, it's CH4. The atmosphere doesn't care what form it is, where it came from. It heats the atmosphere the same. So it actually only depends on where it came from. Was it recently captured in photosynthesis by a grassland system and then the animal ate it 12 months later and turned it into methane a day later? Which means that when it returns 12 years later to the atmosphere or 60 years later, the atmosphere thinks this is recent. It came 60 years ago, it came out of the atmosphere in photosynthesis, so it's not actually completely novel. Whereas if it went into a forest a million years ago as photosynthesis, went underground, became a coal seam, and now we dug it up as crude oil and we burned it, well, when that methane returns to the atmosphere 60 years later, the atmosphere says, this is new. We haven't seen this in a million years. It only makes the difference down the bottom, according to the IPCC calculation. So biogenic methane is 27 and fossil methane 29.8 because it's only the end product that matters, not the CH4. Does that make sense? Yeah, Greg, the whole of life of wool, we had a go at that about a decade ago. We did a full life cycle of wool going through Vinnies, back into the community, back to Vinnies, off to India, re-knitted and sent back to Australia, and then worked out what if a farmer got a credit for the carbon in the wool, how much would that be? And it turned out to be less than 1% of the greenhouse gas emissions of a wool property. So we gave up at that point and went to the sugar industry where there was a material amount of carbon coming out of that industry. So technicality, yes, wool has a lot of wool is still around out of the environment 100 years later, but it doesn't actually make a significant sequestration. If you go to our wool gaff tool, you can go in behind the scenes and see the calculations still there. We just no longer report it on the front page for that reason. So I won't go into the full story, but there's been a lot of debate recently around is methane correctly accounted for? And it's a long explanation, and I'll point you to the webinar that Farmers for Climate Action got Mark Howden and myself to do. Mark focused on the science. I focused on the global equity side of the equation. So hopefully that QR code still works. I tried it yesterday. But if you want the full story on global warming potential star, GWP star versus GWP, just take a note of that and go and have a look at that. Nitrous oxide is a bit different to methane. It's a much longer-lived greenhouse gas, has a much higher warming potential. If you look at the 265 used in the Australian inventory, 273. So you could roughly say it's inert in the troposphere, but it absorbs infrared radiation for about 114 years. So that's pretty big. And then it moves to the stratosphere where it catalyzes the destruction of ozone. So it's 265 or 273 multiplier. About 180 of that is reduction in ozone. And if you look at the graph on the right there, most of the increase in nitrous oxide in the atmosphere is attributable to agricultural use of nitrogen. Erin says, where's a good place to look for case studies or scenarios on emissions intensity and low rainfall cropping versus high rainfall cropping? There's a few published, which I'll try to send out to everyone at the end. I'd caution looking internationally because the reason being is low rainfall cropping in Western Australia is much lower emissions than most low rainfall cropping around the world. It just so happens to be one of the most efficient places with the lowest emissions intensity anywhere in the globe. If you compare the emissions intensity of wheat produced in low rainfall Western Australia with Ukraine, for example, Western Australia, some years they're putting on 40 kilos of nitrogen, whereas in Ukraine they're putting on 200 because they get the rainfall. So the emissions intensity of, unfortunately, don't pick on Ukraine necessarily, but if you do the comparison, the emissions intensity of grain in the UK, Ukraine is closer to 1, whereas Western Australia can be 0.1. Yeah, the tool we would probably suggest is you could use FarmPrint, but you could also use the Grains Greenhouse Accounting Framework tool that I'll show you in a few slides' time. We've used it on 100 farms in Western Australia. If you contact Larissa Taylor in Western Australia, she's got a report on us having applied the tool to 100 grain properties in WA. That should give you a good lead in there. In that comparison, we compared the Cool Farm tool with FarmPrint to the GAF tool and ironed out some of the bugs between them. So hopefully we've sorted that out. Carbon farming and carbon accounting. So what is a carbon account, a carbon audit? It's basically the net greenhouse gas emissions per business unit. I usually talk about an ABN. So think about it on that basis. So if you've got two properties that are separate businesses, they would have a separate ABN. They are separate carbon accounts. If you're all within one ABN, that's usually the way I take it. It's not definitive, but it's per business unit, which could be per unit area as well. So it's all the greenhouse gas emissions minus the annual change in soil and tree carbon. So this is really important that it's not the total stocks of soil and tree carbon, because you can't count the same amount every year. You can only count the degree by which that soil and tree changes in 12 months. A carbon footprint, or your emissions intensity, is just a different denominator. It's the same carbon account, but just this time divided by the tons of primary product produced, tons of milk solids, tons of grain, tons of canola, tons of olive oil, all the metrics, tons of almond seed, just a different denominator. So it gives you a different level of action to take, where a carbon account, really most of your action is reducing absolute greenhouse gas emissions or sequestering more carbon. Whereas a carbon footprint, you can change both. You could increase the denominator, increase the amount of live weight you produce, increase the tonnage of grain you produce by being more efficient, or reduce the tons of greenhouse gas emissions. This is a very useful diagram that Agriculture Victoria, Alison Kelly from Agriculture Victoria came up with this diagram, and I use it all the time. There is a process in Australia I mentioned earlier called the VIAS process, where we are developing a code of standard, a standard for greenhouse gas accounting. This is really important because then if you go to the Cool Farm tool or FarmPrint or Ruminati or whatever calculator you go to, it doesn't matter what calculator your brand is. You just ask the question, is this 100% compliant with the Australian Voluntary Greenhouse Gas Reporting Standard? Yes or no? If it is, then you should get the same number regardless of the calculator. So the way a greenhouse account works, if you take from second left, you've got your scope 1 and scope 2s, your methane from animals and manure, your nitrous oxide from fertilizers, CO2 from lime and urea, minus the amount of change in the soil and trees. That gives you your on-farm basic account. But then in order to get a footprint, you've got to add in the indirect emissions, your scope 3 emissions. What we mean by that is, what did you buy into the farm? If you bought livestock into the farm, you have to take account of their pre-farm emission. What did they do before they arrived on your property, and have they been sold to you as carbon neutral product? You have to take account of the energy required, of the emissions required to manufacture urea, unless you buy carbon neutral urea. Now, the purpose of having those in is to force the negotiation. So next year you phone up your supplier, your fertilizer company, and say, can you supply low emissions urea, yes or no? And over time, we eliminate those scope 3 emissions. Obviously, if you're in Central Australia on a big rural property, there's almost zero scope 3s to talk about because, well, you don't use chemicals, you don't use fertilizers, you don't use much. So now breaking it down and digging deeper into how a carbon account works, and this is what's the process that is embedded in the greenhouse accounting framework tools and the national standard that's emerging. It has to be consistent with the Australian approved, IPCC approved inventory, greenhouse gas inventory method for the country. So in the case of the GAF tools, we've used the Australian IPCC approved inventory method for all greenhouse gas sources and the change in soil and tree carbon. But it can't be in this framework that they apply. Remember, I showed you the emissions from Australia where you had a big bar, a red bar for energy and another one for transport and another one for agriculture. Bits and pieces of all of those apply to the farm. So what we've had to do is take it out and put it into a life cycle assessment framework that's consistent with the carbon footprint of products against the various ISO standards. So it's just a different way of arranging the emissions so that you're capturing pre-farm to farm gate in the way the audit is constructed. And it's calculated on an annual basis. And then we report the scope 3 separate to the scope 2, separate to the scope 1. They are reported separately. So hopefully that answers why the look and feel of the calculators is different when you go to the greenhouse gas inventory for agriculture. The greenhouse gas inventory for agriculture should only be giving you a mix of scope 1s. The scope 2s exist in the red bar. The scope 3s don't exist in the Australian inventory, if you think about it, because the scope 3 emissions for urea, embedded energy in urea, exists in the Canadian inventory or the Chinese inventory. It doesn't exist in the Australian inventory because we don't make it here. But we have to take account of that in our emissions at the farm level. Now, we've got a bunch of calculators. We're busy developing the aquaculture one. We've got wild sea fisheries that's just come out. And the other calculators you'll come across that are consistent with the GAF, in other words, they've actually just borrowed the methodology we've used, is the environmental accounting platform, the Ruminati calculator, the MLA carbon calculator, and the various dairy tools, which is either embedded in Dairy Base or the DGAS Australian Dairy Carbon Calculator. I mentioned the AIA tool because they are taking all our greenhouse accounting framework calculators and building them into one single calculator that your software can talk to in the future. So if you've got commercial farm software like Ag360 or AgriWeb or AgWorld, in theory, you can post your data out to the EAP and get your greenhouse gas audit back seamlessly. That's the design of it. Farm print only applies to the grains industry. Cassie Schaaf has told me the Cool Farm tool has been modified to now include grains and livestock. I haven't caught up with Cassie lately. And there's a new calculator for Australian eggs, but fortunately it's identical to the poultry one we've got. They basically used our calculator to build the Australian eggs calculator. When it comes to sequestration, you've got to remember it's different to greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions, tell me how many animals you've got, I'll tell you how much methane you've got. Tell me how much nitrogen fertilizer you've got, I'll tell you how much nitrous oxide you've got. That can be done on an annual time step. Carbon stocks and fluxes are actually quite fundamentally different, and you've got to appreciate that. because it really depends on what you did in the last 20 years to that soil to know what your soil carbon is today, to know what potential you have to go forward. In other words, if you've been conventionally cultivating that soil for 20 years, it's got no carbon left in it, and it might have high potential to build soil carbon if you put it into permanent pasture. But if you've had permanent pasture in that soil for the last 20 years, you've probably got maximum carbon stocks and nowhere to move because you've maxed out already. So you need to know history to know where you are, to know what you can do going forward. If you planted those trees 20 years ago and they wattles, well, they've got nowhere to go. If you planted spotted gum 5 years ago, well, you're probably in maximum sequestration and have great potential for the next 80 years. So it really does bring us to, you've either got to directly measure, which is exorbitantly expensive, or you've got to model or have a combination of measurement and modeling. Now, if you're looking at soil carbon, the Australian Carbon Credit Scheme has a measurement method that does get used, but it is expensive, as I said. The full CAM model, which is based on the Rothsea global model, is the definitive model for the Australian Tier 3 methodology in the inventory. That's depicted on the right there is a typical full CAM diagram. If you want a really simplistic model, there's one connected on our website called the Socrates model. It's not an official model, but it's 5 questions and you'll get an estimate. So we link that deliberately for people who want a general estimate and don't want to take the time to learn full CAM. If you want your vegetation measured, I'll get to that in the tree section later today. But the full CAM model will do that. It's based on the 3PG model, which is a simplified version of full CAM. If anyone's got the interest in that, I can point you to the right people. But buried in the GAF tools, we've actually run the full CAM model across the whole of Australian bioclimates for multiple species, for multiple soil, multiple locations, and have 500 lookup curves buried in the GAF tool that allows you to look up an estimate of what full CAM would give you for that property. So Erin asked a question with those tools, EPA, Cool Farm. If the same data is added to each of those different tools, they should deliver the same set of numbers as they all draw. That hasn't been the case historically, Erin. It will be the case going forward. That's why we got hold of the minister and said we need a national standard so we can stop getting different numbers out of different tools. There has to be one right methodology. Cool Farm wasn't the right methodology up until recently, but that's been addressed. FarmPrint, we've actually been through and compared the GAF tool and ironed out a lot of the differences, and so they should give the same answer. Belinda, Australia uses international standards for accounting. We based on the international standards, yes. But when it comes to a greenhouse gas account on a farm, Australia has done research in Australia that has been approved internationally, where we now know that if you are in a low rainfall grains situation, your emission factor is different to what would be in Ukraine, different to what would be in the UK, different to what would be in the Midwest of the US. So we're allowed to use Australian emission factors because we've done the peer-reviewed research in Australia. The framework we use is still based on international standards for accounting. The numbers we use or the multipliers have been proven to be Australian specific. So we have that nuance. Greg asked, what can be claimed in terms of property carbon position, regulated vegetation under Kyoto signed away sequestration rights? Look, I'll get to that in the tree section, but as a general rule, what was under Kyoto has gone. The basic difference I see, Kyoto said you've got to plant it after 1990 and sequestration can only be measured for, in a particular way. The Paris Climate Agreement kind of just generally said, if you planted it, you can claim it. We don't care when you did, but as long as it's actually growing in carbon, you can count it. And that seems to be where SBTI, the international frameworks, are going as well. If you planted the tree and it's still growing 80 years later and you can prove it, it's part of your carbon account. I'll get to that later where I'll go into more detail. Now, everyone up for a quick 5-minute break? We've been going for probably an hour and a half. So let's just take 5, and I'll start with this carbon cycle animation at 12:25 Victorian time. Okay, let's get going again. For this. So what I'm going to show you is an animation of the carbon cycle. The purpose of this animation, we put it together because so many farmers ask, why don't I get given a carbon credit for the carbon in my grass or my wheat plant or the wheat that I send down the supply chain, not realizing what the fate of that carbon is, and that it's basically eaten and respired back to the atmosphere within 12 months. So it's not actually a store of carbon. So have a look at the animation, and if it helps you, you're welcome to use it in your work. Can someone give me a thumbs up that it's working? Can you hear it? This is an explanation of the carbon cycle in agriculture. It's based on a grazing system, but the same principles apply to a cropping system. It all starts with sunlight energy and the process of photosynthesis in plants, which allows plants to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and lock it away into a plant. You will notice that we've highlighted the letter C in its various forms of carbon, showing that carbon in CO2 is a gas, but carbon in the plant is CHO, which is a sugar, not a gas. The key point is that carbon takes many forms as it cycles through our agricultural systems. In a cropping system, we would then harvest that plant. In a grazing system, an animal will graze the pasture and convert the carbohydrate into animal products. The majority of the carbon consumed by the animal is belched out or breathed out as CO2 back to the atmosphere. The majority of the animal products or crop products eaten by humans is also respired back to the atmosphere within 12 months as CO2. If that was all that happened, the carbon cycle would be completely balanced.
with all inputs returning to the atmosphere in the same form within a short period of time. However, a small amount of carbon entering the rumen of the animal is converted into methane, CH4, which is carbon in another gaseous form. Methane is fundamentally different to CO2 and has a far higher warming potential in the atmosphere for the duration that it's there. The animal defecates, and so there's fecal carbon in an organic form going back to the soil. Plants will leave litter on the soil surface as a form of organic carbon. As the plant grows, it produces roots, and these roots leave carbon behind either as root fragments or as root exudates of sugars. This organic form of carbon in the soil can either be in a larger fraction, which we call the particulate organic carbon, and turns over fairly fast through microbial action, perhaps in hours through to a few years. The smaller, more resistant fractions of organic carbon in the soil are called humus. These are the more resistant fractions that last for decades through to hundreds of years. In the soil, there are billions of microbes that then work actively on this organic carbon as their food source, actively breaking down the carbon to release the stored nutrients back to the soil to allow the crop or pasture to grow. In the process, these microbes then release the carbon stored in the organic material as carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere, and the carbon cycle completes itself. In a cropping system, this process of mineralization may release 30 to 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year out of the soil organic matter. In a dairy pasture system, it can be as much as 250 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year from the organic matter. The point of carbon farming is to capture and make that cycle as efficient as possible, that we can transfer as much of the carbon from the atmosphere into product that we're interested in producing, which could be meat, wool, milk, grain, and crops. Carbon farming is therefore focused on maximizing the carbon from photosynthesis through to a product that goes to market as efficiently as possible. In the process, good carbon farming would aim to leave as much carbon in the soil as possible, capture some of the carbon in trees growing in the landscape, and minimize the amount of carbon lost as methane and as a nitrogen gas.
So hopefully that makes sense. I'm just adjusting something here. Now, this diagram is the old version of that animation. And what we try to do here is just give you an example of numbers. So, for example, if you grow a 6-ton wheat crop, half of that is carbon. Yeah, so I'll share that animation with everyone. Happy to do that. So when I say 1 to 7 tons next to photosynthesis there, what we're saying is that's either a 2-ton grain crop or a 14-ton pasture, for example. And then you follow that logic through. The only other difference you'll notice is we call humus mineral associated carbon now. The animation was done before that official name change was adopted in the course. So humus, we moved away from because everybody's selling humus now, and what you sell as compost and call humus, the same thing. One of them. There you go. Sorry, bit of noise. So that gives you some idea, and this also allows you to apply some logic to some of the claims around soil carbon potential that might seem extravagant. Just have a look at the diagram. It's designed for that purpose. So I thought what I would do is try and get through the methane section, and then we'll take a lunch break. And then this afternoon come back for the nitrous oxide and soil section. So the methane I mentioned earlier is deliberately short because that's not your main focus in this. This is meant to be a cropping section. But just so that you've got a high-level working knowledge of it, the majority of methane from ruminants, cattle and sheep and goats, it comes out the front end. It's probably not burped out as such. They chew the cud and bring up air in the process, which they then breathe back down and then breathe out the methane later. Not much comes out of the rear end of cattle and sheep. But if you think about horses, those of you who know much about horses know that they can get colic, which is the same as bloat in cattle, but it's just at the back end. So where we have a very small appendix, something like a rabbit or a horse has an extended cecum which does microbial digestion, and so some methane comes out the rear end, not a lot. As you can imagine, there's methane from waste management systems. So if it's a piggery, it's most of the emissions from a piggery. If you look at the diagram below, 90% is actually methane from manure management. Whereas in dairy, it's more in the sort of 12%, if you look at that orange section. So that makes logical sense. But if you look at what's actually been happening to livestock methane in Australia, it's really been on the decline, but not because we've been reducing emissions. But basically, we've kept everything constant except the national sheep flock has continued to decline as we've sold off wethers to change global market expectations. So if you look at the weather, if you look at the national beef herd, hasn't changed a whole lot. If you look at the dairy had a peak in about 2000 before the millennium drought. After the millennium drought, confidence in dairy hasn't been as high, and it's been fairly flatline. Feedlot is increasing quite dramatically, but doesn't show up because of the small numbers, but it is increasing quite rapidly. So you could actually argue the only area of the Australian economy that's come down in emissions has been the sheep sector, but that's because of animal numbers. I don't think it was planned. I find this useful in explaining to people about soils and rumen. The rumen of a ruminant, it evolved about 50 million years ago. First time it's recorded in fossil records. Developed 4 stomachs, one microbial sac being the first part of the rumen. And we naively throw 3-year funding rounds at a 50 million year old problem and expect some fundamental change. Adaptation is a major challenge. Now, when you look at these numbers, I put them out because there are a lot of people enthusiastic about reducing emissions from building soil organic matter, reducing nitrous oxide in soils, reducing methane. All of those are microbial processes. But if you look at 1 milliliter, 1 cubic centimeter of rumen fluid, 1 milliliter, it has 10 to the power of 11 bacterial cells in that little cubic millimeter. Over 200 species. That is unbelievably complex. That's the number, and the soil is much the same. Someone described to me the difference between soil and the rumen is they've got about the same microbial composition per milliliter of soil compared to the rumen. It's just that the soil waits for events because sometimes it's too dry for microbial action and they burst into activity when there's rain or temperature, whereas the rumen is generally always active. I do say this because there's probably a need for critical thinking when it comes to solutions that offer to put a few grams of microbes into the soil and fundamentally change 50 million years of 10 to the power 11 competitive interactions. So just keep that in mind. I'm not by any means saying it can't happen, but just be cautious when the claim is made that you're trying to beat 10 to the power of 11 stable bacteria per milliliter that have been there in competitive evolution for 50 million years. I hope I made the point. What do we do about reducing methane? There's just a general diagram here that says if you want to reduce methane, there's not just one thing you can do. You can manipulate animals by just having healthier animals, better fertility, better weaning rates. We just completed a study in East Africa that said if we treated all the sheep in East Africa for roundworm, how much methane can we save? And it's a massive amount of methane just by making the animals more productive. We can breed for reduced methane production, residual methane production in animals. We can feed them things like oils, essential oils, polyphenols, chemicals, nitrate and sulfate. I get into more detail in the session on Wednesday on that. And then there's some more advanced techniques around inhibitors like the seaweed option or the Bovaer option that was in the media recently, vaccination, which is likely to come through fairly soon if the antagonists don't collapse it completely, because the Bezos and Gates Foundation are putting multi-million dollars of research money into the vaccination concept and early life programming. What drives the methane in the rumen? Well, if you think about it, it's fiber. You put fiber in there, it's anaerobic inside that first stomach of the animal. The longer it stays there, the more time it's got to spend that the microbes are producing methane. So the faster it moves through, like a dairy cow in Victoria that's got very low fiber in ryegrass that goes through incredibly quickly, compared to a much slower passage in Northern Australia where it'll go through a lot slower. The National Greenhouse Gas Inventory works on 20.7 times dry matter intake. And this is a graph we put together quite a few years back when we had all the chamber studies available. And if you think about it, you've got Brahmin on the bottom left. They don't eat a lot. They're probably eating stones mainly that don't digest at all. In Northern Australia, they don't produce a lot of methane because they don't eat much. There's not much to eat and it's very low quality. Whereas if you go to dairy cows in Victoria producing 60 litres of milk at peak lactation, eating 25 kilos of dry matter, they proportionately produce more methane just because there's more going through, even though it's higher quality. But the main thing that changes the slope of that curve is secondary compounds like tannins, saponins, nitrate, sulfate, oils, things that we can get out of supplements or out of our existing legume plants. So I'll play the nitrogen cycle animation and then I'll take a lunch break after that and come back to the nitrous oxide section. So this is a similar animation to the methane one. It just explains the nitrogen cycle and where nitrous oxide comes from.
This is an animation of the nitrogen cycle in agriculture. Although this includes a grazing animal, the principles for cropping systems is much the same. While most of the nitrogen cycling in agriculture comes out of the microbial breakdown of a soil organic matter, the left-hand side of this diagram explains some of the primary input sources. Small amounts of nitrogen can come from rainfall and possibly volcanic events. But the majority of nitrogen entering our agricultural systems comes from synthetic fertilizer, legumes fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere, or from animal dung and urine recycling nitrogen. Nitrogen can enter the soil in many forms, but would mainly be in either the ammonium form or the nitrate form. In most aerobic soils, the ammonium is then converted fairly quickly to nitrate. In cold, wet soils common in southern Australia, that conversion can be much slower and plants might preferentially take up ammonium. Whereas in northern Australia, in drier, hotter, warmer conditions, less anaerobic conditions, the conversion of ammonium to nitrate can complete in a few days. The other input of nitrogen into the soil is obviously from animal excreta in the form of dung or urine, which would largely be in the ammonium form. Plants then take up the nitrogen either in the ammonium or nitrate form. In colder weather conditions common in southern Australia, wet winters, there could be preferential uptake of ammonia. In drier soils, there may be preferential uptake of nitrate. In the case of a livestock system, the animal then consumes the nitrogen in the plant and recycles some of this back to the soil through their excreta. Unfortunately, in most of our agricultural systems, the nitrogen is exported out of the system down the supply chain instead of being returned in a more of a circular closed-loop nutrient cycle. Nitrogen can be lost from the soil in three main processes. Nitrate in the soil moves readily with water, so if there's leaching of water beyond the root zone, this will carry nitrate with it into the groundwater. In waterlogged soils, nitrate can be denitrified and lost as a gas of either nitrous oxide or dinitrogen. Nitrogen can be lost as ammonia gas either directly from urea fertilizer being applied to soils or livestock urine volatilizing as ammonia gas.
So hopefully that gives you an idea of the nitrogen cycle and where the points of influence are. In some cases, atmospheric dinitrogen, most of the air you breathe is N2. So if that's the end product and it's not nitrous oxide, that too could be a positive outcome. I'll send a link during the lunch break. I'll put a link in the chat. If that doesn't work, I'll send the link through email and we can circulate to both of those. Quite happy for you to use them in your presentations as you develop your Train the Trainer programs. Let's take a lunch break now for what, 20 minutes, half an hour? Do we start at 1:15? Is that okay with everybody? Does that give you enough time to run the toaster and make an egg? Thanks, mate. So 13:15, we will start. All good. See you at 13:15. Everyone back. Hopefully we can continue where we left off. You'll notice that I've posted a few things in the chat there. I think Erin was asking if I could post the Western Australian carbon neutral grains pilot, which I did. That link is in there. And then the two Dropbox links, hopefully they work for you. If not, let me know. But that's the MP4 video files of the nitrogen cycle and then the carbon cycle. I find if sometimes when you're doing a long presentation, it's very useful to have that as an animation. It explains things reasonably well, and then you can step back and let your voice take a rest as well. All part of the plan. Let's go into nitrous oxide from agriculture. Hope everyone's on board here and has been following the presentation. Look, it's a very complicated subject, and you've got to remember that I've spent 25 years in this space. So if I seem like I know a lot, well, I should, because I've spent 25 years with it. The point is that there's a lot of resources available for you to catch up on areas. So, you know, like the recording, we're doing a recording of this. I'm hoping that either university or the department share that. The notes will be sent out. But again, I'll open the door to say if there are specific questions where you want more information, we can always look at providing that. So don't feel like you have to know everything at the end of this presentation. There's no exam. How does nitrous oxide form from agriculture? Well, there's two processes. One is denitrification. I'll show you the diagram in the next slide, but this is generally something that happens in warm, waterlogged soils with excess nitrogen. So nitrogen's been applied, the soils are warm and waterlogged, the microbes have got a lot, it's anaerobic conditions, and you get nitrous oxide forming. Fortunately, in a lot of Australia, it's either cold and waterlogged in southern Australia, or it's warm and not quite waterlogged. Well, people in Cairns would think differently, or Townsville would think differently right now, because that's very waterlogged. Nitrification is a much smaller process. So those of you in Western Australia with the more sandy soils, low rainfall, the sort of drier grains region, that's the main process operating in your case, because you very seldom find situations where your soils are waterlogged. It tends to happen more during the summer period, warm aerobic soils, and a very minor loss. So to be honest, if the loss you're experiencing is from nitrification, you really don't have a problem. But it is part of the calculation. But what both of these point to is inefficient use of nitrogen. And you can see in cropping systems, we do a lot better than grazing systems. But in grazing, because urinary nitrogen is so unquantified and unmanaged, a lot of the nitrogen can be lost from that. Cropping a bit more efficient than that. So here's the diagram where you think of any form of nitrogen that comes into your soil, where from fertilizer, if it's DAP or urea, diammonium phosphate, monoammonium phosphate, they're all ammoniated sources of nitrogen. There's not a lot of nitrate sources. Potassium nitrate might come in as nitrate, but Not a lot of, and calcium nitrate might come in as nitrate, but mostly come in the ammonium cycle. Legumes would do the same. Dung would be the same. Urine is ammonium source of nitrogen. And when the soil breaks down and releases nitrogen through mineralization, it comes in as ammonium form first. That first stage of aerobic conversion is when that gets rapidly converted to nitrate in the soil, which happens in dry soils, it happens rapidly, but in wet soils, it might take weeks before it really completes. A small amount of nitrous oxide can be lost through that nitrification process. But what we're mostly concerned about is high loading of nitrate in the soil that then forms in anaerobic saturated soil conditions where you lose nitrous oxide. And if it's really saturated, it all goes out as dinitrogen. Now, here's the dilemma we face, where you've got high use industries like dairy, sugar, and cotton, and some horticulture industries are pretty high as well. But they typically are at your 200 kilo limit, sort of median rate of nitrogen, some higher, hopefully a lot lower. But if you look at the blue there, it shows you the grains, the use of nitrogen in grains. Typically on a per farm basis, it's a lower rate than the cotton, dairy, and sugar industries, but it's applied over massive millions of hectares across the country. So the grains area cumulatively is responsible for more nitrous oxide, but the emissions per hectare are measured in less than a kilogram per hectare, typically 200 grams of nitrous oxide nitrogen per year lost from our extensive grains industry. What are the key factors involved here? Well, obviously nitrate, any form of ammonium or nitrate in the soil, ammonium converted to nitrate, but nitrate being the substrate. It's a microbial process, so if the soils are really too hot, but they would have to be up in the 40 degrees, or too cold, so you're talking about below 5 degrees, the process is quite moderated by low temperatures in, say, Tasmania or southern Victoria, or some of the coastal soils in winter. Soluble carbon can be a limitation in cropping systems. So you think of some of those arid cropping systems in southern South Australia through to Western Australia. Because of cropping and low soil carbon levels, there's not a lot of soluble carbon as the energy source for this microbial process. Obviously, if you go to your dairy pastures, there's plenty of carbon because there's always carbon available. But then the last one is what I emphasized in the first few slides is anaerobicity. In other words, you could measure that as compaction or water-filled pore space. How much oxygen is actually in the micropores of the soil? And you look at that diagram on the right, it explains the process quite neatly, where think of the water-filled pore space as a surrogate for irrigation or rainfall. And you go to wilting point on the bottom left at about 30%. It varies between soils. As you get some moisture in the soil, but most of the soil is still aerobic, you get nitrification happening. Then you get most macropores filled with water. The soil is becoming anaerobic. You get nitrous oxide forming. And then as the soil becomes completely saturated at beyond field capacity, up to saturation, it's all becoming dinitrogen because there's no oxygen left at all. So think about this from an irrigation point of view. Irrigation starts at wilting point and goes to field capacity back to wilting point, which is unfortunate. If you're good at irrigation, you should maximize nitrous oxide loss. That's just unfortunate. But here's the real kicker, I think. This is some work we did under the National Nitrous Oxide Research Program. On the left, you've got a number of cropping sites, albeit eastern seaboard, so they're not really the low rainfall ones in Western Australia, which I could also allude to. But those cropping sites, the canola, sorghum, are getting high rates of nitrogen, higher than what you might get in the really arid wheat belt. And you're still only losing less than a kilogram of nitrous oxide nitrogen. That Wagga site is 200 grams, going up to 400 grams, maybe 500 grams, close to a kilogram. Then suddenly you go to your high rainfall dairy systems where there's a lot of urinary nitrogen going on. So those dairies aren't putting on 495, 750, and 598 kilos of nitrogen. That's 200 kilos of urea nitrogen as fertilizer, plus the urinary nitrogen adds another 200. So now you've got high rainfall, saturated soils. Gympie would be and Camden would be fairly warm and saturated. Terang would be just winter saturated. But it's the urine that's really driving the higher emission factor there. Then you've got two other examples of land use change. What I mean by that is the Hamilton, the green bar, is where it had been a long-term sheep pasture with a lot of organic nitrogen sitting there, high organic carbon, high organic nitrogen, and they plowed it up to put in a wheat crop, and they lost the biggest amount of nitrous oxide we've ever measured. Is from that soil disturbance event, then resulting in that loss of nitrous oxide, pretty much all within 10 days. And then the last one, the sugarcane one, is an acid sulfate soil on the New South Wales coast. Sorry, up Ingham. It's an organic soil at Ingham, which is further north. And that shows you the problem of dealing with some of the sugarcane soils that can go from bare sand, which wouldn't produce much nitrous oxide at all, through to acid sulfate, which would produce kilograms, multiple kilograms per hectare in a year. Now, when we started this work back in 2000, an emission factor in the inventory just said all nitrogen fertilizer applied across Australia is multiplied by 1.25% is deemed to be lost as nitrous oxide. Very blunt IPCC default position we were in back then. We've done a lot of research and changed the nitrous oxide factors as we've gone into various industries. And the latest publication of the inventory in March 2024 basically has disaggregated that into low rainfall cropping, high rainfall cropping, irrigated pasture, dry pasture. Sugarcane probably still needs to be disaggregated into those three soil types, sand, organic, and acid sulfate, to really reflect an industry that spans over 1,000 kilometers north to south. But how it works in the calculation in our calculators and in the inventory, it's total nitrogen applied in that industry, times that emission factor, times a conversion from nitrogen to nitrous oxide. That is basically it. It's saying of the nitrogen applied in sugarcane, 1.99% is deemed to be lost as nitrous oxide. That's it. How do we measure nitrous oxide? Well, you've got to contain the emission out of the soil. So somehow you've got to say, well, here's a soil that's losing nitrous oxide. So your most basic measure is just a bucket, top right corner. Put a bucket on the soil, measure at time zero, measure an hour later, and the change is the rate of nitrous oxide loss. Then we got smarter and said we're going to automate this process with opening and closing lids using hydraulics. Amanda, some people, their IT managers don't like Dropbox. So for those of you who it doesn't work, I can come up with a OneDrive link or something a bit more secure. Dropbox isn't liked by any institutional computers. Don't try it with CSRO, they hate it. So if you go back to the manual and automatic chambers, these then close the lid automatically. There's cotton, there's wheat there, there's pastures. They close the lid, measure at time zero, measure an hour later, then open the lid again. And so you get a rate of emission all the way through the day. This is the example from Western Victoria that I showed you, where we plowed up a long-term pasture and put it down to cropping. There's the rows of chambers that we ended up with. And that's where we lost all the nitrous oxide. This is in Griffith in New South Wales, looking at either wheat or maize, where we have to have taller chambers, and we do the measurement on site for the nitrous oxide. And then this is a dairy pasture in northern Victoria, where you've got two adjacent irrigation bays, and it's that device on the left there is a three-dimensional anemometer. So it measures three-dimensional wind speed, which tells you how much air is passing the sensor at any one time, going upwards or downwards, and you've got the concentration. This generated for us 3 years of data from every 0.1 of a second. So it gives you high resolution. But what it tells you is the understanding of how this process works. So if you look on the graph on the right, this is a biological process. You could imagine that being a flood irrigated system where nothing's happening at all. And then suddenly the soil gets flooded to a certain degree, and it all happens within a few seconds. So this is the problem with people going out with a bucket and then going out 2 hours later with another bucket. you could be either side of that peak and completely miss the point. So that's why we went to continuous measurement, because it can change so dramatically. So what do we do about nitrous oxide? Well, there's a bunch of things we can do around animals, which I won't go into in too much detail, but that would be about breeding plants that have a better energy to protein ratio, feeding diets that have a better energy to protein ratio, bringing more legumes in that have more tannin in them that can slow down the nitrogen cycle in the animal. In cropping systems, it really goes back to rate source timing, the 4 R's they talk about: rate source timing, placement. I've left off placement for the meantime, but I think formulation should probably come in as well here, which we'll deal with. And then are there things around polyphenols that can slow down the nitrogen cycle? But don't forget that this is a process that's stimulated by water saturation and by compaction and therefore irrigation. So the compaction of the soil is really important, keeping fluffy aerobic soils. That's where your organic matter comes in, keeping the soil more aerobic, avoiding waterlogging with nitrogen, and irrigation management becomes really important. So let's dig into a few of these one at a time. We talk about the fertilizer rate and source in particular in this case. Don't worry about what industry this is. This is just an example of saying, as you put on more nitrogen fertilizer on the left, you get more dry matter response, whether it's wheat, canola, pasture, and the numbers there are the efficiency slope. In other words, the units of growth in product versus the nitrogen applied. So 13.3 kilograms of dry matter per kilogram of nitrogen. And your nitrogen is most efficiently used on that linear portion of the curve. But there comes the day of reckoning where you've applied nitrogen that exceeds the plant soil system's capacity to utilize the nitrogen. Nitrogen is very, very tricky. It's one of the most leaky elements we've got in our system. So what happens when you exceed that? Well, the right-hand graph comes about. And you can see that as you apply more rate of nitrogen per hectare, there's an exponential increase in the loss of nitrogen, either as leaching, ammonia, or nitrous oxide. It'll go out in one of those forms. And that's because on the right-hand side of that diagram, there is surplus nitrogen that exceeds the ability of the system to utilize, and it's just being lost to the environment. That's why we're so particular in saying, let's stick to within this dotted line band of the appropriate rate of nitrogen. So for dairy, for example, that would be 40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per rotation. In grains, it could be no more than 200 kilograms of nitrogen in high rainfall zones, no more than about 60 to 80 kilos in low rainfall zones, things like that. Here's an example of where it has been going wrong. There are plenty of examples of response curves in cotton, which show that up to about 200 kilograms of nitrogen, 180 is probably the recommended rate of nitrogen in cotton for maximum yield response, for optimal yield response. Then we do find a lot of cotton producers put on more nitrogen. And part of the problem is that nitrogen is cheap relative to the cotton price, relative. And so in your arid, low rainfall grains industry, you can't afford to over apply nitrogen because it's critical to your success. You get it too low, you limit the yield. You get it too high, you waste a lot of money. Whereas it's not true in sugar and cotton, which is why we see more nitrogen being applied, and comments from farmers saying we just sleep better at night. It was interesting to see during the millennium, during the end of COVID, when urea price went up threefold, how most cotton producers were putting on 180. And that dotted line there shows you what happened to the nitrous oxide. This is a dairy example, but I use it because it explains wet versus dry and source. So you've got 4 groups of bars in each season where 50 kilos of nitrogen was applied in each of those seasons to a winter rainfall climate in Gippsland in Victoria. And you can see that in the winter, if you applied nitrate, a nitrate source, ammonium nitrate in that case, you lost far more nitrous oxide because half of what you apply was already in the nitrate form, ready to go off as nitrous oxide. Urea was a safer source to use in those wet soils. And that's a generic principle that if the soils are wet and saturated, and likely to produce nitrous oxide, and an ammonium source is always safer than a nitrate source. But look at the summer, when everything's dry, the soil moisture is down at about 14%, not a lot happening. It probably doesn't matter because the whole process is driven by water and there's no water. So the lesson learned there. Here's another, it looks very complicated, but I'll break it down for you because there's a bit of a lesson in here. On the bottom, you've got a water-filled pore space. So those rises and falls are your irrigation events. So this is on the Riverina in northern Victoria, and you've got a bit of rainfall coming in the middle here, which flattens out the soil moisture curve. It dries out again, irrigation event dries out. In response, you've got two adjacent irrigation bays, each receiving a certain amount of nitrogen, and both receiving nitrogen, and then you see the nitrous oxide. The point I'm making here, if you remember that first graph that I showed you, as you get to saturation, so you think of a big bay of irrigation water coming down that takes you from wilting point to saturation within an hour. And so you're not going to see any nitrous oxide for the first 24 hours until that starts drying down to field capacity and then goes down to wilting point. That's exactly what you see. Irrigation event happened, nitrogen got applied at the same time, no nitrous oxide for 48 hours until the soil dried down, and then all the microbes said, thank you very much, and off they went and produced nitrous oxide. But very quickly getting down to wilting point again. And the pattern repeats. There's a grazing event during a saturated soil, not much happening because it was saturated. Stayed saturated, not much happening because it was saturated. And the moment it dried down to a certain amount, off went the nitrous oxide as a result of both grazing and input. So there's a lot of information in that slide. That brings us to the addition to the 4 R's. So I mentioned the 4 R's, rate, source, timing, placement, but I would add fertilizer formulation to that now and say it's equally important. And you've got urease inhibitors and you've got nitrification inhibitors. The urease inhibitors on the screen now is largely a product called agrotane, which is coated on fertilizer like green urea. Pretty sure CSBP have a product where they coat with both, but the Western Australians would know that. What it does is it blocks the urease enzyme. So when you apply ammonium to the soil like urea or urine, which is also liquid urea, it has to hydrolyze. And that hydrolysis process of breaking it up into ammonia is activated by the urease enzyme, which is quite ubiquitous on all soils and vegetation. There's plenty of it around. What this product does, agrotane, it blocks that urease enzyme for up to 2 weeks, which means that it gives the nitrogen some time to get into the soil before it breaks up and reduces ammonia volatilization. So you can see on the right here, the blue, which is urea, both in autumn and spring. And then there's a green urea, which is your agrotane treated, and a polymer coated urea, which is a slower version of urea. Quite effective at reducing ammonia loss from that. So Greg is apologizing, but no need to apologize. Not sure I understood why the nitrogen release from calcium and ammonium nitrate is so high. Let's go back to that, Greg. I'll show you. So think of what we were talking about earlier, where if it's in the ammonium form in cold, wet conditions, it stays as ammonium for a very long time. It actually doesn't convert to nitrate very readily. So you've got this sitting there in an ammonium form, and it doesn't become nitrate very readily, whereas the ammonium nitrate, half of what you'd apply is ready to go. So that's the difference in the middle of winter there from just a wet soil keeping ammonium urea in the ammonium form. Obviously, ammonium nitrate, half of it is ammonium, which is also slow to change, but half of it is nitrate, which goes straight into an anaerobic soil in the middle of winter, saturated soil, and is directly lost as nitrous oxide. So you wouldn't want to do that. Tell me if I've got this wrong. How's the nitrogen and the urease reflected in the carbon calculations? Yeah, look, it's tricky. We have just produced a version for Nutrien, the company Nutrien, that does recognize the inhibitors in the carbon calculations. I'll get to that in a moment once we've gone through both. But Greg, was there something else on sugarcane you wanted to highlight? Because I went back to a pastures example, not a sugarcane example. Anyway, just type the reply, and I'll come to the sugarcane example in that emission factor bar, the red bar you're talking about probably. That was a particular soil type. And what we're emphasizing there is sugarcane can go from a sandy soil like at Mossman, for example, all coastal sandy soils. But when you come down to some of the New South Wales soils, there's organic peat soils there that just have a huge amount of nitrogen sitting in them. And when you apply nitrogen to those soils like they do in sugar, they belch a huge amount of nitrous oxide. So I guess the point I was making is not that that's common to all sugarcane. It's just common to certain soil types. If you went to a sandy soil in sugarcane up sort of North Queensland, you probably produce very little nitrous oxide, whereas down on these acid sulfate soils, you can produce a massive amount. So it's just the variability in those. Let me come to the other one about the carbon calculations, because I'll show you a bit of a logic here that's emerging. So we've got urease inhibitors, and then we've got nitrification inhibitors. The urease inhibitors, they inhibit ammonia production. That's completely separate. The nitrification inhibitors, they block that nitrification process where ammonium is converted to nitrate. So you'd say if you went back to some of those examples from sugarcane, Greg, if they'd used an inhibitor, they would have had a dramatic change in the amount of nitrous oxide produced. So below are some of the chemical compounds, DMPP, nitropyrin, DCD, and some of the commercial brand names associated with those. So some of them are more prevalent in the United States, for example, but Entec is quite strong. Instinct is more, sugarcane hasn't done enough research to justify the different emission factors. We've still got to get onto that. We do have enough data to say it can go from 0.5 to 7. That's a huge range. And putting an emission factor out at 1.99 as an average is just a very rough. You can imagine if you're an individual farmer doing your own carbon audit and you get 0.99, if you're that sandy soil that gets 0.5, you've been hard done by. But if you're that acid sulfate soil that does a 7, you've got a free ticket. So it's generally right, but very rudely, specifically wrong. So we need more research on those different soil types to disaggregate that emission factor. So going back to the fertilizer formulation, so we were talking about these nitrification inhibitors. So the next few slides I'll show you are from various industries on what I call the market failure. Now, you've got to remember, coated fertilizer is about DMPP coated fertilizer. Let me use that as an example. So it's an inhibitor coated fertilizer. It's about 14% more expensive per unit nitrogen. So you would need to know that your productivity will go up by 14% to break even by using the product. And herein lies the problem. If you look at this graph on sorghum, you've got control treatment and then putting on urea. And there's definitely a benefit. So urea is definitely a winner there. It's giving you more dry matter yield, more grain yield, more protein yield. But now you go to coated fertilizer, and remember, you've now paid 14% more, and there's no significant difference in the yield, the dry matter, or the grain protein. You go to entrench, another one, or polymer coated urea, all about 14 to 20% more expensive, and you're getting no productivity benefit at all. Why is that? Well, because you're only saving 200 grams of nitrogen. You're not saving whole kilograms. So don't think that it's going to reflect in a dry matter yield response, because all of it is about reducing a small amount of nitrate leaching or nitrous oxide. If you go to sugarcane, same story emerges. This is Wei Jing Wang's work. Putting on 100 and 140 kilos of nitrogen in that first sequence, you can show a definite yield advantage, which is why farmers would put on up to 200 kilos of nitrogen. Now you go to polymer coated for those two rates, or nitrification inhibitor coated urea, and there's absolutely no productivity gain to be had by paying 14% more. And then Dave Rawlings did this work on subtropical kikuyu pasture at Gympie, zero nitrogen, putting on urea. Those subtropical pastures, kikuyu pastures with good rainfall, they love a bit of urea. But the moment you go to polymer-coated, DMPP-coated, or green urea, which is the agrotane ammonia inhibitor, there's nothing in dry matter yield. So I call it a market failure because there's clearly a environmental benefit, but not a productivity benefit for the farmer. So I'm going to come to it in a moment, because now what I'm going to go to is what I call a sort of 4-point plan for the cropping industries. First of all, you remember I spoke about scope 3 emissions and how they are accounted at a farm level unless you choose to buy urea from a lower source. Turns out there is a difference. So if you're buying it from Canada, the reason being is they do the Haber-Bosch process to make urea in the same factory as they recycle that CO2 into making urea. So you've got internal efficiency gains of recycling CO2, and Canada's emissions footprint for the urea is 1.7. Whereas if it's made in China, it's made in 2 separate factories. One where they make the ammonia and they release the CO2 to the atmosphere, and then they take it to another factory where they have to donate CO2 into the urea molecule using methane, which produces its own emission. That's why theirs is 2.8. So we're already seeing companies differentiate in where they buy urea from, and actually selling you urea deliberately as a low emissions footprint urea. That's already happening. But I reckon the future lies, if you do a web search, which I just did to pull up these companies here, that's the number of companies that are offering you to do small-scale urea at your local town, or small-scale urea using surplus solar on your farm. And they have different technologies in there, and some of them are at different stages of development. But there should be one called Jupitertronics. Jupitertronics was one that came from a presentation we had from the cotton industry at Melbourne Uni with engineers in the room. And they worked out that most of the water pumping in cotton is off-grid solar now. And you don't pump for 12 months of the year. And so this off-grid solar is sitting idle. And so they cooked up small-scale hydrogen production, which produces green hydrogen from solar, that can then be used to make ammonia on farm. And these companies are pushing fairly strongly into this area. So I would say within the next decade, most of the nitrogen on farm would be made without fossil fuel emissions, which would be a good thing in itself, because disconnecting it from the fossil fuel price is just a good idea. So that's one. So that, unless if you hadn't noticed, the scope 3 emissions on a cropping farm is about 1/3 of all, 25% of all the emissions on cropping is this. It's the pre-farm footprint of ammonia. So straight away, by changing where you buy it from, you can drop that by 50%. But the future is you can drop it to 0 through these green ammonia technologies. Then the other thing we highlighted was the crop residues. In the original inventory, it just said 1% of all crop residue is deemed to be nitrous oxide, which was a huge number. And you can see in the 2020 inventory, 32%, 33% of all emissions from the cropping industries were deemed to be this residue that goes back to the soil, which we want to have happen because we want to keep the stubble in place. So we made a strong argument with government that the calculation should change, and it now goes to the arid IPCC factor of 0.5. If you go to GRDC and you look at, they've now got this under their belt by having invested in a project with Queensland University of Technology to refine all those emission factors even further, and you could guarantee that's going to come down quite a lot further. So research is important to actually drop these numbers just from an accounting point of view. But the National Nitrous Oxide Program also did a lot of work on what's the difference between urea in terms of its emissions. So you can see those are the emission factors used in the inventory, as opposed to the emission factor associated with coated DMPP-coated nitrification inhibitor-coated urea. And you can see quite a difference between the two. So that means that we come back to that previous argument about it's effective to reduce nitrous oxide because on average, the data we've got suggests coated urea, if we switch the entire cropping industry to coated urea, we'd save close to 70% of the nitrous oxide overnight. But it won't stimulate yield, which means it's a market failure. Farmers are not going to do it unless there are incentives. So that's where that insetting model comes in. That's where government incentives come in. That's where industry, the fertilizer industry working with government could actually play a strong role that in the next decade, we only have coated fertilizer in Australia at an affordable cost. That would be the solution there. But of course, it doesn't get us around best practice. And best practice remains quite critical to the process. And that's why we've worked very, very strongly with cotton on MyBMP and dairy on FertSmart. I wrote those guidelines for dairy. Grains BMP, 6 easy steps in sugar, the Fertilizer Australia's FertCare program, the 4 hours, and you can see rate, source, timing, placement, and formulation all being important because you can coat the fertilizer, there's still a residual emission that has to be managed to be more judicious about the management. I'd also throw in here greater use of legumes. We're starting to see that come in. We come from a great legume culture probably 40, 50 years ago, and then got hooked on the bag nitrogen. And we know that rotations with legumes improve soil health, soil nitrogen, soil organic matter, a slower nitrogen cycle, all of those things. So we're going to see more inclusion of legumes in rotations in future to give the soil a break and a rejuvenation. It'll ask, is there any field trials for high rainfall areas for the use of coated fertilizer with regards to yield that can show farmers and workshops to support the science? Yes, there would be plenty. I would point you to, I can share a publication along the way. This publication itself is a meta-analysis. So it summarizes multiple studies done on all those industries. And each one of those studies is available and referenced and accounted for in that publication. So let me take that on notice and send out that publication for everyone so they can use that and say, there's the evidence in front of you. So non-irrigated crop, low rainfall, high rainfall, you can see the difference between rainfall zones. Irrigated, pasture irrigated crop, cotton's all irrigated. So you've got both there. Non-irrigated pasture, that would be high rainfall dairy pasture because generally you don't put nitrogen on pasture unless it's dairy. It's not common otherwise, or it's got plenty of rain. So you could assume that to be high rainfall as well. Worth noting, I know this is a cropping session, but let's blame the ruminants for something. It's quite surprising to most people that most of the nitrogen eaten by a ruminant comes straight out the back in the form of urine. Now, to qualify, if you're at Kidman Springs in the Northern Territory and your animals are deficient of protein, it's not as high. Thanks, Patrick. That is the publication. But in dairy, more than 60% of urinary nitrogen is lost and never completes the cycle. So what do we do in those cases? We've done a lot of work in this area and shown that just simply balancing the diet, getting enough energy to protein, in other words, don't feed them on 25% crude protein and deficient energy so they don't have enough energy to metabolize the protein. So getting things in balance is really important. The summary of nitrous oxide here. If you think about dairy, sugar, and cotton, those are the high rainfall or irrigation industries that put a lot of nitrogen on. Perennial horticulture and viticulture tends to be very low nitrogen. A lot of them are underground drip irrigation, very judicious use of nitrogen. They might use high rates of nitrogen per plant, but per hectare, it's exorbitantly low. So, for example, mangoes in the Northern Territory, we're quoting rates of 60 kilos of nitrogen per hectare equivalent. But when you considered it was drip irrigation and at a point going to the rate source timing and placement, it was effectively 6 kilos of nitrogen per hectare that they were effectively putting on. So very low nitrous oxide. Dryland grains, low rainfall, lower nitrogen inputs, low nitrous oxide. Unless you're in high rainfall canola, then the emissions are slightly higher, but still nowhere near what dairy would be. Annual horticulture can be a bit of a mixed bag because we've come across lettuce producers that put on 400 to 600 kilograms of nitrogen because they're on sand around Clyde South, eastern suburbs of Melbourne. So it would be really dependent on how much nitrogen they use, but at a cumulative level across the economy, it's not high. And then extensive grazing. To be honest, most of the cattle in Northern Australia are highly protein deficient, so there's not a lot of nitrous oxide being produced. So if there's any questions specific to nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle, things that I haven't covered, I'm happy to come back to that, because we will now move on to soil carbon sequestration. If anyone struggles to get that publication from the link that Patrick put in, I can circulate that edition. There's a lot of papers there. All right, soil carbon. What is soil carbon, first of all? And you'll find that I like to differentiate between what is soil carbon and what is soil organic matter, because soil carbon is kind of a term that emerged because the fossil fuel industries want a carbon offset from the land sector, and so they talk about soil carbon. From a farmer's point of view, you shouldn't care about soil carbon, you should care about soil organic matter. Now, it just so happens that about half of soil organic carbon is soil organic matter. Soil organic carbon is about 58% of soil organic matter. That's just because it's mainly made up of carbon in the organic matter, but actually what confers the productivity benefit to the farmer is not the carbon, it's the organic matter. And I'll get into this in a moment. So soil carbon is generally made up of, if you think of the soil as that pie chart on the left, you've mainly got mineral component to the soil, which would be your silica, for example, the bits of rock. And then some soils have soil inorganic carbon, that's limestone accretions. So if you're in the Eyre Peninsula or some areas where there's obvious lime accretions in the soil, Mount Gambier, you would see soil inorganic carbon, not present in a lot of soils in Australia. So what we're concerned about is the green, soil organic carbon. And it breaks down onto the diagram on the right, where I think of that diagram on the right as, if you could imagine it as a time scale of survival of the soil carbon. So you've got your microbes, and they last for seconds to minutes to hours. They turn over so rapidly. That's the point of the soil. You want as many microbes in there as possible to turn over that organic matter the whole time and to release nutrients out of it so the plant can grow by getting free nutrients out of the organic matter. Well, not totally free, they're just recycling it, but it is a reservoir. So they're not very stable. They explode into action when there's moisture. They go dormant when the soil's too dry, but they are working away all the time. And then you get the labile carbon, or the particulate organic carbon, which I think is your decadal time step carbon. So it's your larger fractions of soil organic matter, root material that's broken down, forms the labile component. That's more decades. So, you could say 10 to 20 years, it turns over. There's no sort of magical cutoff here. It's just a way of describing the soil. So you want lots of that because you want it to turn over rapidly, same as the microbes to churn over the soil. You want to put it in rapidly, you want to take it out rapidly so the soil is healthy. Then you get a variable component called what we used to call the humus, but we now call stable mineral associated carbon. That describes what it actually does. These are your very fine fractions, and because the clay is charged, the clay particles are charged in the soil, you get this electrostatic attraction where these very fine organic matter particles are sticking on the clay. Now, that's really important to remember because if you don't have clay, you can't build soil carbon. So those of you in Western Australia, down Esperance Way, up Geraldton Way, you would know soil carbon of less than 1% is pretty normal. Whereas if you're on the Liverpool Plains and you've got 7% soil organic carbon, you've got lots of clay to hold carbon, which is why you can get up to your 7%. So that's your stable. And the reason why it's stable is because it's that charged reaction with the clay and the soil. So you want lots of that stuff as well, but that is more your 20 to 100-year pool of carbon. So think of the microbes as hours, the labile as decades, and the stable as multiple decades. And then you get the resistant, which really doesn't do much for us. That just represents historic burning that might go back 10,000 years in Australia. Because it's charcoal from when big fires came through the rangelands of Australia and burned and left charcoal behind, resistant carbon sitting in the soil. But being realistic about where we can build carbon is really around soil type by rainfall. And if you think of Australia's massive landmass, it has become very attractive to politicians. And I had a direct conversation with the Greg Hunt back in the day about this, where he caught on to this idea that if we could just change soil organic carbon by 0.01% across all the rangelands of Australia, we deal with all the emissions Australia has produced. Well, the problem is it's not positive 0.01 all the time. It's minus 0.01 50% of the time and positive 0.01 the rest of the time. So the idea that it's very attractive to politicians to say we can do this. The red dot in Tasmania is where the person was when we generated the graph. That's Matthew Harrison, I think, sitting there in Tasmania. An artifact, I hadn't noticed that before, the red dot in Tasmania, but that's Burnie in Tasmania. Yeah, Greg, do we have a strong picture of carbon history? I would put it to you that the rangelands haven't changed much. They've been low and they will remain low, but they're probably higher than they would be if we disturbed them. You could probably argue some of the overgrazed regions of Northern Australia have lost carbon. But I do have some photos coming up of what Australia used to look like. So you can imagine we've lost a lot of carbon from the baseline. So if you think of most of the green and blue areas were under some form of sclerophyll forest or long-term undisturbed rangeland, they would have had higher carbon than they have today. So we've got a long way to go back to where we were. But you can't come up with an average, because if you're on a vertisol on the Liverpool Plains, you could be 7%, could be your baseline. But if you're on a sandy soil at Esperance, 0.3% is probably not a bad number. So it's really dependent on the history and then the soil type. Hopefully it will become clear. Let's see if we get an answer to you, Greg. Here's another picture from David Rawlings on the same farm, 500 meters apart, emphasizing that you've got a granite sandy ridge on the left in the blue, and not even 500 meters away, you've got a bottomland vertisol clay soil that can build substantial amounts of carbon. And so you've got to stratify how you sample carbon. You can't assume one sample across a paddock is going to be adequate, because what's on the left and on the right are vastly different populations of soil carbon. Now, what is carbon and what is not carbon? And I think there's a lot of confusion between what is and what isn't. Some people who claim to have a lot of soil carbon actually mean they've got a lot of carbon, not soil carbon. What I mean by that is plant residues on the soil surface, highly transient, here today, gone tomorrow. Think of your lawn clippings. You mow the lawn today, you don't pick up the clippings. 10 days later, you come back and there's no lawn clippings. They've all gone. Where did they go? The microbes ate them. So buried plant residues, the bigger residues up above 2 millimeters, that's not soil carbon. And the microbes can't be soil carbon because they're here today, gone tomorrow. What is soil carbon is when you get down to your finer fractions, things that we can bank on for a decade at a time, like the particulate or the mineral associated, which we can bank on for multiple decades, or charcoal that'll be there over 1,000 years. These are things that are the finer fractions, and that's what counted as soil carbon. Now, not to be controversial, but a lot of people in the regenerative movement would say we've got lots of soil carbon. What they mean is they've got lots of carbon. And that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But they've got a lot of what's in the dotted red circle. They've got a lot of residues on the soil surface. Yep, that reduces evaporative loss of soil moisture. Buried plant residues and microbial biomass. Yep, we want lots of that stuff. So we don't knock it because it's important, but it's not soil carbon. The translation between those in the red circle and what we call soil carbon is not automatic, and it takes decades to happen. So you can't assume that because you've got lots of plant residues on the soil surface, you will have higher soil carbon. That's not an automatic assumption. But as I said, soil carbon is so much more, soil organic matter is so much more than soil carbon. If you think about the biological roles, a reservoir of nutrients, soil organic matter holds nitrogen and potassium, soil carbon doesn't. Biochemical energy, resilience, biodiversity. Well, soil carbon doesn't increase biodiversity, soil organic matter does, because your microbes are there for the organic matter, not for the carbon. Water retention, that's soil organic matter that holds water, not soil carbon. I think I'm making a point. But if you add together, I'll show you some slides in a moment where we took just two of these attributes. Now we're talking about, multiple roles, biological, physical, chemical roles, all of those that confer long-term sustainability on our soils as the benefit of high soil organic matter. I took just two of those, reservoir nutrients and water retention, and tried to put them into productivity terms. And the next few slides, you'll see that. Yeah. So we've got to think of soil carbon as a function of inputs, and the inputs can be plant growth. You can talk about imported carbon by bringing in 10 tons of compost, but that's not new soil carbon. You've just taken it out of the left and put it in on the right. So if you're doing carbon accounting, you've got to deduct it out of the carbon audit on the left and put it in on the right. So you've got to be careful that imported organic matter is not new soil carbon. The soil carbon that results from the better plant growth as a result of bringing in that compost is genuine new carbon. So it all goes back to plant growth. And the outputs are a function of microbial turnover. That's what we want. So it's a function of inputs and outputs and lots of time. Unfortunately, in our enthusiasm, we want the time to be shorter, but actually decades are probably the only fair metric for soil carbon. The problem we've got in Australia in highly variable climates is in a high rainfall year, you get a 6-ton wheat crop, you get a 14-ton pasture. But in a drought, you get a 2-ton wheat crop, and the inputs go down. Whereas the outputs, the microbes are still there. They work on whatever's available. They ramp up when you've got more, they ramp down when you've got less. So you have this situation where we go forward quite dramatically in good rainfall years and go backwards quite markedly in dry rainfall years. So what we hope to do is, on average, go forward. In other words, in the good years, maximize the amount of plant growth we can get, how much we can get put into the soil, don't disturb the soil, don't result in microbial turnover to increase, and then in the bad years, hold your position as much as possible. But Elaine Mitchell published a paper that showed that in Australia, we can explain most of the annual change in soil carbon, 70 to 90% of annual change in soil organic matter can be explained by annual cycles of El Nino and La Nina. So quite marked. I found this diagram quite useful in the thinking. And that is to say, we often give farmers the expectation of potential from actual, not attainable. I'll explain that. So your actual soil carbon is what you have today as a result of your management, rotation, soil disturbance, plant productivity. Let's say that that's 3% soil carbon. On the other end, you've got potential. What can the soil handle? If you had the absolute maximum rainfall, you've got the best clay content, you're on the Liverpool Plains, everything's working for you, you could achieve 7%. But you'll never get there unless you have the rainfall. So what the attainable is what you can realistically get to. You might never get to the 7%, because if you have 750 mils of rainfall, not 1,000 mils of rainfall, or you have cold winters, you might only get to 5%, not 7%. So when we're talking to farmers, we've got to set their target from actual to attainable, not to potential, because potential is ethereal. It might never be achieved, because if you just can't get the rainfall and the temperature to work for you, you'll never get there. I think it's quite important in communication. Now, this is complicated, and I'll just leave it with you to pore over. All I've done here is given you an example of a soil carbon calculation so that you can repeat it for a particular farm if you need to. All it's saying is if you've got a 0 to 10 or a 0 to 30 soil sample and it has changed by 1.5% soil organic carbon, or you could even say it's a total of 1.5, say it's a very sandy soil. And that's 15 grams of carbon per kilogram of soil. And you've got a bulk density of 1.3 grams per cubic centimeter. The calculation below shows you how you then calculate that you've got 19.5 tons of soil organic carbon per hectare. That's just a calculation. You can change any of those inputs, and hopefully if you follow how to convert a mass of soil to a hectare to a 0.1 depth, or a 30 centimeter depth would be 0.3. 1.1 or 1.3 grams of bulk density gives you the mass of soil, which then multiply by the grams per kilogram of carbon in the soil. Don't forget that if you've got 19.5 tons of carbon, that's not CO2 equivalent. You've got to multiply that by 3.67 to convert that to tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, because that's just tons of carbon. Now, just a reality check in making sure we get this right, because one of the problems we are seeing is when we're sampling down to a meter with a hydraulic corer, the right way to get bulk density is to dig a hole right down to a meter and go in through the sidewall where you haven't compressed the soil. And that way you get an accurate estimate of the uncompressed bulk density of the soil. So if you want bulk density down at a meter, you can't really do it with a hydraulic core going from the top, because the massive hydraulic pressure you've got to put on it basically compresses the soil, so that by the time you get down to a meter, what was a 1.1 density is now a 1.3 density. And look at the difference it makes. If you just take my calculation and you change the density from 1.3, which says you've got 19 tons of carbon, to 1.1, it says you've got 16.5 tons of carbon, or 61 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. A major difference just by getting one measurement wrong. That's really important. How long does a soil organic carbon measure last for? Belinda, I think of it more as you take a measure and it's your baseline. So what we're working on is, can we provide you with a simple equation? We call it a pedo transfer function, which says, let's take a farmer's standard 0 to 10 sample. And if you know the soil type, you know the depth of the soil, you know the history, you can use a model like the Socrates model to convert that into a 0 to 30 or a 0 to a meter. I would say your soil organic carbon shouldn't change dramatically in a 12-month period. But the problem you've got, and just take this on board for what it is. If you speak to people like Peter Grace, he says the error in our ability to measure soil carbon is about 30%. The annual change we can expect in soil carbon is less than 30%. And so taking annual soil samples to prove a change in soil carbon is actually probably still working within the bounds of experimental error. In other words, are we fooling ourselves by measuring soil carbon annually, because the random variability in the answer we get? I'll give you an example. If you take a transect through a field of a series of carbon cores, and then a meter offset from that, you take another one, and you send those both to the laboratory, they'll have about a 20% difference between them. That's just in-field error. Then if you take all those samples, mix them up into one super sample and break that up 100 times, send that to the laboratory, you'll get a 10% variance in the answer. That's laboratory error. Put those two together, you've got 30% error, which is bigger than the annual change you could see in soil carbon. Patrick, so coming back to my story about the depth, Most farmers sample 0 to 10 or 0 to 15 for routine soil sample. What we would like to do, and are planning on doing, is giving them a means by which they can tick an extra box in their routine soil sample to get soil organic carbon or organic matter, and then apply a simple model to assume what that would be down to 30 centimeters. Because sampling to 30 centimeters is really expensive. If you are following the government's ACCU protocol, you would sample to 30 straight from the beginning. But that becomes very expensive. So you've got to be ready to spend a fair bit of money in sampling. Because the moment you go 0 to 30, you're not talking about a handheld corer, you're talking about a truck-mounted hydraulic corer and a much more expensive sampling regime. Seed treatments to increase carbon sequestration levels. Can the biology survive? Yeah, look, Erin, I'm out on a limb here, and I've consulted with some of the best scientists in the country on this, and I regularly go back to Professor Robert White, who is a retired colleague of mine, who I ask about this particular question, and it does come back to you're putting microbes into an environment that's got 50 million years of stable evolution, and you're expecting those small amount of microbes to completely revolutionize competitive evolution. It is unlikely. A lot of the evidence is being shown in pot trials where soils don't have the microbial diversity they have in the field. And you'll find lots of studies on pot trials in glasshouses, but you won't find many peer-reviewed publications in the field proving what you've just asked. And therein lies the problem. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. What I'm saying is it's not been proven. And so technically you can't claim a carbon credit on the basis of a technology that's not in the peer-reviewed literature. Because one of the things with the soil carbon methodology is you have to actually stipulate one of a number of activities that you've taken to build soil carbon, and what you've described isn't one of them. So I guess that's the problem. There's more evidence required before we can go down to that level. I'm trying to be quite cautious here about what I say, because it could be that something like that does work. For example, for generations now, we've coated legume seed with rhizobia specific to enhance the nitrogen fixation of the legume. That's well-proven technology, and it does work, because what you've done is taken a rhizobia that is specific to the root, and when that root emerges, the rhizobia is there. So you created that association. If you just apply it on a hectare basis and haven't created the association, you're straight away going into competition with 10 to the power of 11 other microbes that have been there before. So the chances of that working is much less. Now, I get castigated all the time for saying that, but that's what I find in reality. When I consult, and I don't take this lightly, when I consult with the likes of Peter Grace, David Rawlings, Bob White, retired professor who wrote the definitive text that we've all studied at university. The other thing I'd like to point out is two things on this graph here. This is one of the longest experiments run in the world, the Rothamsted experiment, where some fields have actually gone for 300 years. What it shows is soil carbon gains are not quick. So there's not massive jumps in soil carbon year to year. What you've got on the left here is a common starting point where a lot of the soil was under cultivation. And then they continued to cultivate the soil with the dotted lines, and they turned them into permanent pasture with the solid lines. Two different soil types, two different fields. And you can see soil carbon accumulation takes time. It's not a quick process, but it eventually levels out and plateaus. So you can't expect it to go infinitely into the future. So there's a couple of things in this graph that I think are quite of note for us, is that you could go up that solid line for a period of time, but the moment you reverse the method that you're using, in other words, you've been putting on more fertilizer, more irrigation, lack of soil disturbance through permanent pasture, the moment you cultivate it, you're following the dotted line straight away. So some of the cropping groups are taking this quite seriously. Like talking with Birchip not so long ago, Ian McClelland is saying, well, we'll deliberately sawtooth. In other words, we have to put in crops. But what about we deliberately create a rotation that sawtooths that so we get a constant soil carbon rather than the dotted line eroding it. In other words, you rebuild it with the pasture phase, you put a legume in to restore organic nitrogen, then you go back to wheat, you drop it through the wheat phase, but back into pasture afterwards. Those rotations could actually become really important in the future. Here's two examples of farmers' experience that we have monitored ourselves. Many of you might have heard about the Jigsaw Farms example. Mark Witten is a very passionate farmer up at Hamilton in Victoria. He is a livestock producer, so this is permanent pasture. But you can see soil carbon basically 2008 to 2018 and a resampling in 2021. You wouldn't be game to say there was any net change in soil carbon. That's because Mark's been doing this for over 25 years now. So 25 years ago, this was a very low stocked onion grass dominated place and was converted by 2008 into high producing pasture. And soil carbon was increasing through that conversion phase. But 25 years later, it's all leveled out. The same is
another example from Fiona Conroy and Cam Nicholson, who are quite well known in this area. And they very publicly claimed carbon neutrality in the early years of converting their property. And that was fair because they did a lot of landscape restoration. But Fiona has been quite...
So sorry about that. That's a recording that I had on that slide that I didn't realize that just before I started this, I thought I'd throw that in. So you can see what's happened. So Fiona Conroy and Cam Nicholson would have said they were carbon neutral up until about 2005. And they were, because the soil carbon was increasing. They were doing some very serious land restoration. But this is Fiona's own interpretation that basically growing season rainfall is driving whether it's going up or going down. And it responds pretty quickly to growing season rainfall either way. So sorry about that. I'll make sure that's gone next time. The next two slides are really trying to get at why we should promote this to farmers. And that is the inherent productivity benefit that you will get from soil organic matter. So here we took the long-term phosphorus research site at Hamilton in Victoria, which was on a vertisol. And we said, well, let's create scenarios using our models to say, well, we know the solid blue line there because that's actual data that we've got over 25 years of building the permanent pasture. And we then simulated what would happen to that soil if you had two different soil types at high rainfall locations or Birchip low rainfall locations. And what you can get from this is if you take the striped line of lower soil carbon and you compare the extra productivity value in terms of hay equivalents or in terms of how much nitrogen was required to achieve that extra, we were getting somewhere between $40 and $100 of productivity benefit per hectare per year just from having better soil organic matter in these two systems. That's quite dramatic. And on its own, that would pay more than carbon would in the long term, if you think about that as being a perennial return. Then we took the low rainfall site at Birchip where we knew the system was water limited and said, well, what if we just attributed using existing research we'd conducted? What if we said a high organic matter soil can hold more water than a low organic matter soil? And there you've got the two soil types, and you've got another $26 to $73 of productivity value per hectare per year just from the ability of high organic matter soils to hold more water. So, and then you go back to that previous diagram I showed you of 20 attributes that soil organic matter offers. None of them associated with soil carbon, all associated with productivity benefits from having more healthy soils. That's what we really should be promoting to farmers. But we've also got to be realistic about it by saying different soils can hold different carbon. We've dealt with this quite a few times. If you take the sort of left-hand side of that diagram as being a sandy soil at Geraldton or a sandy soil at Esperance, if you got to 0.8% soil carbon, you'd be pretty happy, because most of those soils are well below that, but they could never go above that because they just don't have clay. On the right-hand side, if you were on a ferrosol on the Atherton Tableland or West Gippsland, you'd pretty much want to have 6% soil carbon, because you've got plenty of clay there, you've got plenty of organic matter you can increase in that soil. So the target differs quite dramatically on how much clay you've got in the soil, but also how deep the root system might go as a result. Now, a bit of a reality check in the next two slides, unfortunately, and that is that climate change itself is going to have quite an impact on our ability to hold soil carbon. This goes back to that same study I was showing you earlier, where we said it's a complex diagram, so let me just break it down quickly. On the left-hand side, you've got the low rainfall Birchip. On the right-hand side, Hamilton, high rainfall, 750 mils of rain. You've got two different soil types at each site. You've got a high starting point on carbon, a low starting point on carbon. None of that really of great influence, other than the bars above the line are what we would call optimistic climate change scenarios, where it's warmer and wetter. The bars below, the ones with orange in them, just look at the orange bar in particular, is the most realistic scenario for that region. When we run our stocking rate model in this as a grazing system, it actually says if we want to hold today's soil carbon intact at Hamilton, we have to, by 2070, we'd have to reduce stocking rate by 50% to hold today's soil carbon where it is. That's not building soil carbon, that's hanging on to what we've got. We'd have to have 50% less animals. And if you're on the left in the lower rainfall region, 80 to 95%. So this had quite an impact on Victorian government policy, which basically says, let's not put soil carbon in as this miracle saving of our emissions profile, but let's set the target to rather have farmers maintain current stocks of soil carbon into the future. This is supported by other research by Annette Cowie's team in New South Wales, who looked at the cropping industries on the same basis, that the average change in soil carbon across Australian dryland cropping, an upper limit of more rainfall, an average of status quo, as opposed to the right-hand side, which is actually what is actually predicted, and that would be a decrease in soil organic matter regardless of management. So let's be realistic about what we can achieve in soil carbon. Any thoughts about that? I know there were some thoughts. I'll just see if I didn't miss any. No, I think. Come back to Greg's question. Do you have a strong picture on the carbon history in Australia? What was the change with the development of Australia? We know that we've lost a substantial amount of carbon from our cropping systems across Australia. That's inevitable, because the moment you plough, you've seen some of the data I've shown you today on the loss of soil carbon. It only takes one disturbance event, and you will spend the next 2 decades restoring what you lost in the one renovation event. The long-term phosphorus site at Hamilton had this fascinating data set that 25 years later, we got very excited that the high phosphorus treatment had shown a steady increase in soil carbon, until we realized that actually 25 years ago, when we disturbed the soil to plant the better quality crop in there, we had lost carbon, and it took 25 years to get back to the control treatment. So that was a reality check for us. It wasn't actually building carbon, it was just restoring what we lost through soil disturbance. I'm going to show you an animation now. I've spoken a lot about jigsaw farms, and I do show it because it's quite an important case study that we did. It is a grazing system, not a cropping system, but I think important in that Jigsaw Farms has planted 23% of the farm down to trees and achieved carbon neutrality for about 5 years as a result. The law of diminishing returns is a real beast.
Hi, I'm Mark Whitten. With my wife, Eve Cantor, we farm in southwest Victoria. We trade as Jigsaw Farms. We have 8,500 acres running a wool, lamb and beef operation where we offset the carbon footprint of our ruminant animals and reach carbon neutrality in 2010-11 through planting out nearly 20% of the farm to trees. We started in 1996 and we started doing what at that time was considered perhaps best practice in terms of grazing operation, which was fencing a land type, using shelter belts and doing a lot of plantation work. As we continued on, the seriousness of climate change became a motivation in our own lives, and we're involved on farm and off farm in that issue. And we decided that carbon neutrality was an aim we were trying to do. We then went through a massive tree planting, and over that time we planted over 1 million trees, half for agroforestry or sawlog timbers and half for permanent revegetation and shelter belt forms. And with the whole farm planning, we wanted to make sure that from a shelter point of view, so lots of shelter belts were put in, that we had different income sources from timbers further on, and we wanted to increase the fertility of both the flock through genetics, but also the pasture through fertiliser program. So if you want to have good soil carbons, you need to have a good ground cover on your pastures, or in a cropping situation it would be the same, and that's how we increased our soil carbons. Our soil carbon level here now is just under 4% across the farms, and we test down to 1 metre. So we've got very good data to prove what we're doing. If you look behind, this is a containment area which is holding 7,000 lambs at the moment, which will be all weathers, which will be shorn in the next few weeks, and then they will be sold for meat. And then they will, by being in here, they are protecting our pastures. We've made an active decision to stay with the merino operation here for 2 reasons. We think genetically we've got a lot of movement, and we're continuing to do it to improve our fecundatory levels and therefore lower our carbon footprint. The other thing is we think wool is probably the premium and best moving towards carbon neutral fibre in the world. We've discovered through this that economic sense and carbon sense are actually hand in hand. And that's the story of Jigsaw Farms in a nutshell. That by being high input system, by being profitable, it allows us to do the offsets and to do the good environmental works, but still give a very good return. And I think that's where the future is. From a producer point of view, we would like research to be focused on giving us farm level carbon measurement tools, technologies that we can do to change the behaviour in terms of methane reduction of our animals. That we could come with a ready reckoner which says, if I do a whole farm and want to plant trees here, what will be the carbon sequestration opportunity, both from a species point of view, from a size point of view, from a climate point of view. We're also very keen from a stewardship point of view to hand over to my kids a viable carbon neutral operation which allows them to lower, and again I hope they get better at it than we are going forward, and being carbon positive I think would be the aim for them, a legacy which is going to last beyond me and others. I'm slightly unusual in that I feel very positive about climate change going forward. I think we have the tools and I think we have the will to do what we're going to do, and I think on a farm level we are doing it now, and I'm feeling very excited both from technology change and from by using genetics and understanding trees and understanding sheep and genetics going forward. We can run a high input, high output system, be profitable and be carbon neutral.
So I hope you get inspired by that. There's a few videos that you can find online about Jigsaw Farms. Look, to be fair, Mark is a highly motivated person. So where he does pasture, it hasn't got any weeds. He knows exactly the phosphorus content of his soils. Where he does biodiversity, he does it extremely well as well. Where he does forestry planting, he does that well too. So quite extraordinary if you ever get a chance to go there. Another key to Mark's operation is that he and his manager, if you see them out in the field together and have the opportunity to watch them interact, they complete each other's sentences. They are so in sync that they know that they share the same vision. So there's a couple of keys to Mark's success. But later on, I'll go through some examples of the data though that we've got from Mark's farm. Let's take nothing away from that farm. So in terms of tree carbon, it's obviously another form of sequestration, and Mark has tapped into that because admittedly he's done very little about the methane and nitrous oxide. He's mainly focused on renewable energy, so he's got a solar farm. He's planted forest, environmental plantings, as well as spotted gum or a number of eucalypt species in what he calls his superannuation scheme. So in terms of tree sequestration, a couple of definitions. What came out of the Kyoto Protocol about in order to qualify as a forest, it needs to be 0.2 of a contiguous hectare. Plants need to be greater than 2 meters tall and have 20% canopy coverage. That's still used as a guideline, but if you think about where that came from, because a Landsat pixel could only do 30 meters by 30 meters, that was the maximum resolution they had from the eye in the sky. That's actually why it was like that. Had nothing to do with whether that was valid sequestration or not. Post-Paris, you would have heard me say earlier, I think the Kyoto definition was found to be too limiting. And if you think of what the Paris Agreement did conceptually, it didn't say top down, tell us. It basically said every country come to Paris and tell us what you can offer. So it was kind of a bottom up. You put on the table what you can offer, and we'll bank that. And so within that same thinking, it seems like what's happened is, if it's a valid sequestration and you can prove it, then that's fine. But remnant vegetation, unfortunately, we need to be quite firm about this. A lot of farmers are saying, well, we've got bush on the farm. Well, that bush would have been there with or without you. So all you can claim is the change in that bush as a result of your management over the last decade or so. In other words, there were goats, you've now fenced the goats out. You've done something different to enhance the vegetation, and you're not claiming the total. You're only claiming the degree to which you have influenced that. There's a lot going around at the moment that vegetation in Tasmania is growing faster as a result of atmospheric CO2, which it is. There's a couple of papers out that our pollution is our solution. And that's obtuse. It's not actually valid because we can't claim obtusely that our increased atmospheric CO2 is enhancing tree growth, so therefore we don't have to worry about our emissions. That's obtuse logic. So what do we do with species? What are the key factors? Species makes a difference. If it's a wattle, it probably only grows for about 18 years, black wattle. A spotted gum will probably peak its growth at around 80 years and then it curves off. Climate and soil make a difference. So temperature, water, nutrients, high rainfall regions, you probably end up with faster growing eucalypts in those regions anyway. And then competition. The paddock tree always grows to more expression than a forestry tree because what forest has to do is compromise between full expression of the tree as opposed to maximum growth of the tree. So plant competition plays a role as well. I mentioned that the GAF tools have provided you with an estimate of tree growth. And what we did is we took the full cam model and ran it in multiple bioclimates and multiple species and soil combinations across Australia and came up with these types of curves, 100-year growth curves that now sit in that model. I think it's about 400 and something growth curves in there. Not perfect at all, but at least it gives you a good approximation of the difference between a fast-growing eucalypt or fast-growing tree and a slow-growing, what might be a mallee or a wattle or something like that. Slower ultimate growth. Now, the tricky part with trees is measurement. I once paid an auditor to go out and measure trees on a farm, and it cost me $20,000 for a week, and we measured 1% of the trees. I guess there was a learning in there that no farmer is going to be able to afford to have a carbon aggregator come out and do, or a forestry expert come out and do all the measurement. even though direct measurement is probably the most accurate, it's probably the most expensive. Now, what we mean by allometric equations is on the bottom left, you've got a way in which an assessor will go out and say, well, let's measure the tree diameter at breast height. Let's estimate the height of the tree using algorithms and measure the canopy cover of the tree, put that together into an equation, and each tree species each bioclimate has got an equation, and you can estimate the carbon in that stock. The other way is to use the full cam model. It's cheaper, but it is quite conservative. In the case of jigsaw farms, we pretty much had to double the model estimates because we did the modeling. Mark Whitten looked at it and said, it's absolutely no way it's that low. So we sent out an auditor to go and do some measurement. We then sent a LiDAR drone out to go and get a whole heap of measurements, and basically came up with a justification that we needed to double the outputs of the full cam model to even get close to reality. It's easy to understand. So not to say full cam is flawed, but when you tell full cam that there's an environmental planting here, at the particular jigsaw farms, it assumed everything is black wattle. It assumes they're all 20-year-old wattle. So now full cam gets told it's 20 years old and it's black wattle. Full cam says there's no carbon left. That's no annual carbon. There's a stock of carbon, but it's not growing. So all it takes is a few volunteer eucalypts to still be growing 20 years later that the model doesn't know are there, and you can be 100% out in your carbon estimation. So you always need to ground truth the model to what is actually on the ground and whether what you told the model is actually what is really there. That was a lesson for us in that. I mentioned the gaff tree calculator. This is an example. We've got 4 tree planting options in the simple spreadsheet for you. You tell it what state you're in, what region you're in within that state, mixed environmental plantings or sugar gum or whatever you want to tell it, what soil type, what area, and the age of the trees. Now, one of the things we do with remnant vegetation when farmers say, we want you to count our remnant veg, we tell them to put it into the model there and to give it 100 years. Because if you think about a sigmoidal growth curve, after 100 years, it's going to give them a 0 result, which is actually the truth. Because after 100 years of existence, that remnant vegetation is not net sequestering any carbon anyway. So they get the point about that. Then you're allowed to allocate it to whatever industry you want in the model. So that's lookup tables. The Look-See tool is something that CSIRO developed. It's quite different. The Look-See tool assumes nothing is there. It says, if you wanted to do a carbon project on this area of land, as you define the area of land in the model, using points on a Google Maps a map, it then says, we know the area, and if you did an environmental planning project, you would get 25 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So it assumes greenfield, and it suggests how many carbon credits you could generate if you did method A, method B, method C. So you've got to be careful about how you use the number you get out of that, because it estimates total and annual sequestration over a 25-year period. You've got to say what of that number is relevant to what's actually achieved on the property we're dealing with. It's not the same thing. Then there is the full cam model, or the Flint Pro model, which is basically the previous custodians of full cam went private and have taken the full cam, an older version of the full cam model, and put it into a spatial framework. So they do quite a few assessments of farmers. If you give them the georeference coordinates of your property, they can give you a carbon audit on that property as an official record. That's if you wanted to use the carbon as part of your carbon audit. Now, the question we get the whole time is, why doesn't harvesting count as an emission? Why harvesting does count as an emission? Now, you would have heard me talk about jigsaw farms and Mark's trees, the spotted gum plantation, which is his super scheme. So straight away, some of you might have thought, well, what happens when he chops that down? The reality is what the science tells us is about 40% of a fast-growing eucalypt will end up out of the environment for 100 years at a time if it goes into construction timber. So if you chop that eucalypt down, about 60% is tailings and sawdust. About 40% will end up as actual timber locked in the frame of a house for 100 years, if it goes into that, if it doesn't go into pulp and paper. But you've got to remember where this all came from. We're in a transition phase from the Kyoto Protocol days where one person in Canberra had to do a carbon account for all the trees in Australia using data that was publicly available or available to them. And so the assumption was the moment the satellite says the tree's been cut down, we consider it to be a loss to the environment, regardless of where the timber went. That was fine for an inventory. We're in a dynamic change at the moment where the whole world is doing bottom-up accounting now, where the farmer is saying, well, actually, I did harvest those trees and I know where they went. I can tell you that 40% is sitting in a frame of a house downtown. So it's not the same as pulp and paper. It can be there for 100 years. But for the inventory people, tracking the life cycle was costly. However, the ACCU method for plantation forestry does allow a certain amount of timber to be counted as being sequestered out of the environment. So there is a method in Australia where you can generate carbon credits using the plantation method, and it uses a default in FullCAM of how much timber remained out of the environment 100 years later. Little black boxy if you think about it, because what we would like is to know we can actually tell it where the timber went rather than the model say the average spotted gum in the whole of Australia, 40% went into timber. That's not quite as much of a credit back to the farm. But let's switch it around, like we did with soil carbon. What we're finding is actually, if you focus on the co-benefits of trees, not the carbon benefits, if you focus on the carbon benefits, you pick the worst soil block at the back of the farm and you plant a square block of trees as your carbon sequestration. That's what I would do because it's the least valuable land or the most marginal land on the farm. If you start with the premise that there are co-benefits that are bigger than the carbon benefits, you would plant very differently to get the shade and shelter, the biodiversity, the wildlife corridors, the erosion, the reduced salinity, the capital value. You would do more of an amenity planting, or you would plant on the western boundary of the paddock in Western Victoria, or you would plant on the windward side to prevent erosion. Now, we've just finished a project called Trees on Farm that interviewed over 400 farmers on these co-benefits. And it turns out that if you put the co-benefits together, first of all, you would plant the trees differently. But secondly, the return to the farm is bigger from co-benefits if they're properly planned than from carbon benefits if it's just a block at the back of the farm. So I would keep that in mind. Now, the thing with jigsaw farms to keep in mind is Mark never planted trees for carbon. Back when he started planting trees, he had biodiversity in mind. And so to say the farm is no longer carbon neutral, so he hasn't achieved much, is actually quite disingenuous, because the biodiversity benefit of the trees that he's planted is going to deliver to his property for eons to come. The benefit of the higher carbon stocks in the soil is going to deliver for a long time. He lambs down his lambs in the most treed, sheltered paddock because he gets better lamb survival. So think about it like that actually the co-benefits of the trees on farm is not about carbon. It might actually be sort of that become the co-benefit. So we did 2 case studies along this line. Sorry, they're both livestock, but then I'm a livestock guy, not a cropping guy. We started out with a big land restoration project near Yass in near ACT. But it just so happened to be a very low-stocked 5 DSE farm system with low methane, but the erosion in the gullies was significant, so there was absolutely no soil carbon left in those gullies. We had to start from 0. And so when we did the carbon balance, if you look on the right there, the greenhouse gas emissions below the line were pretty modest because of a very low stocking rate. But soil carbon in the slopes, soil carbon in the gullies was quite substantial. And then the tree restoration that took place was very substantial. So now this farm, we've just been doing a catch-up audit with them, they are still strongly carbon positive, but probably because of that land restoration, which is ongoing, and the low emissions. That then led us to this Jigsaw Farms example, which said, well, can you do this on a high stock farm? Because if you've got high stocking rate, 20 DSC to the hectare, you'd need at least 20% of the farm down to trees. And so we quantified the Jigsaw Farms example. But you can see, unfortunately, there that the trees and the soil don't match the greenhouse gas emissions at the high stocking rate. So while you had some approaching carbon neutrality on balance, not quite there. So this is what the 2016 audit looked like. You've got the livestock emissions, you've got the positive of the trees, and you've got the positive of the soil. Both of them flattened out in that audit. So really, in 2016, we always predicted the farm would only be net zero between 2010 and 2017. Turns out that was pretty real. We've just redone the audit now in 22, where you can see the agroforestry and the permanent re-veg, a bit of neutrality there, close to getting there in 2 peaks subsequently, but on average, not carbon neutral. This has kind of led us to promote something around farm carbon audits, where is it actually fair to run a farm carbon audit on an annual time step if you're including trees? I'll show you why. Cumulative carbon stocks, yes, spotted gum holds a lot more than wattle, for example, as your sequestration. But look what happens on an annual basis. This is our measurement with the model combined. And you've got this really lumpy approach where the farm was very clearly carbon neutral for a few years around here, carbon surplus, in fact, and nearly got carbon neutral here, nearly got carbon neutral here. So what we're suggesting in the national development of guidelines is saying, yes, do the greenhouse gas emissions on an annual time step. But when you're talking soil and tree carbon, actually 5 years to a decade is probably more fair, because if you do a running average, there's another way of looking at this farm and saying, what if we took those peaks and we carried those forward and filled the gap further down and smoothed it out over a decade? Then our calculation says this farm is 83% carbon neutral for a decade at a time, which is a far better way of looking at consistency of marketing, consistency of approach to market. If you want to inset that along the supply chain, a far safer approach to take, where no one's being dodged out of carbon. It's valid carbon, it was there. You took the surplus and you carried it forward into the deficit. A far more logical approach. So you do the carbon greenhouse gas emissions annually, and what we trying to negotiate in the national framework is let's take a decadal time step. If you're not monetizing soil and tree carbon, let's take a decadal view of it, and you get far more certainty for the supply chain. So let's summarize that. I think I lost the chat in case there's something in there. No. Let's go to the chat. Erin, is there a way that we should be designing environmental planning projects so that you could benefit from the biodiversity down the track? Or is there a project you think has done this well in Western Australia? Pretty sure I know of some down near Esperance that have done some of that. I don't know if you know Kirsty Smith down that way. She could probably point you, or Susanna Macbeth, involved in. I'll find Susanna's name. She's down Albany way. But yeah, if you were designing environmental planting, there's a couple of things we would do differently. If you talk to Mark Witten, he wouldn't change a lot of things, but what you would do is not just plant short-lived acacia species. You would definitely sow the secondary succession into that. So the mistake, a lot of what Mark's mistake was planting it all to short-lived wattles. 20 years later, it's all mature and dying, and you've got a regeneration, a second generation going. And the only actual net carbon growth is from volunteer eucalypts coming through. So why not put the eucalypts in at the beginning and let them come through in a mixed environmental planting right from day one? and you've got 80 years worth of sequestration to deal with, and the biodiversity is far better as a result. So you would do that. The other thing in what I was trying to put across there, if you take salinity management into consideration, which is what Mark did in a lot of the property, a lot of it was for salinity management. It just so happened he had to follow the creek lines as a result, and now has wildlife corridors through the property that give massive increases in biodiversity. The figures are something like the Bird Atlas got 43 species 25 years ago and 173 species a couple of years ago. So that's a fairly dramatic increase in biodiversity that is actually in a formal record that they've got an audit on the farm. So I don't know, Aaron, if there's enough in there, but there's quite a lot of focus now on biodiversity. And there's at least 3 academic groups, one at Melbourne Uni, Melbourne Biodiversity Institute by Brendan Wintle, one at ANU, looking at biodiversity, and then one at University of Queensland. So quite a lot of focus in biodiversity plantings. I don't know about Western Australia in the universities there. I'm not familiar with any of those. But if you know Richard Harper at Murdoch, he'd be able to point you in the right direction. He's an old colleague of mine that used to work in this area. If there's any other questions before we wrap up, but as we wrap up through this slide, think about anything else you want to post. What do we tell farmers? Well, it's coming. So you need to know your number. Now, there's something in this. If you think about how the rules are starting to emerge, we're starting to see them. 2030 is when those targets start. So everyone says, oh, well, we've got 5 years still. No, we don't, because you need 5 years of running data. So that's actually a wake-up call for everybody saying, hang on, we need 5 years of running mean data to show what our baseline is for an industry. That means 2025 is D-Day. So know your greenhouse gas number. Yeah, Belinda, is your number? I would say know your number, but if you look at the mandatory reporting of government, they've got a whole lot of disclaimers in there that it will not be onerous at the beginning. What I read that as code for is we're not going to hang you out to dry if you get it wrong in the first few years, because we're all learning together. So I would say pick a valid tool, a tool that complies with the national standard that's emerging. So the greenhouse accounting framework tools will do that. The environmental accounting platform will do that. The Ruminati tool will do that. Use those tools to the best of your ability. Yeah, that example, Hayley, Larissa probably does have good case studies in WA. So I'd need to get clearance to share Larissa's email, but she's pretty easy to find if you just do a Google search. I would say know your sequestration number as well. But more than just know your sequestration number, know where you are and why you are where you are and what its potential is to move forward. If you've been under permanent pasture, if you're down in Gippsland and you've got permanent pasture, or you're in Bega and you've got Kaikuyu going for the last 40 years, you've got nowhere to move in soil carbon. You've maxed out already. But if you're in a degraded situation or if you're down at Esperance and you've done subsoil claying, well, you could go from 0.5 to 3% carbon, 4% carbon through subsoiling. So know your maximum potential. Then check out what your supply chain target is, because your value chain has targets. You need to know what they are and how they intend to get there. I would say take independent financial advice, because you could look at generating a lot of money out of soil carbon credits, for example. You could get millions of dollars of income through carbon trading. You might lock yourself out of your own supply chain later when they come saying, can you socialize those with us? but take advice on whether short-term gain is better than long-term engagement with the supply chain. And then start with the do now strategies, which is existing best practice will change emissions intensity. So I think that's good news to talk to farmers, because if those supply chain targets are all emissions intensity, then you've got a conversation straight away you can have with farmers saying, well, go to your industry and get the best practice manual for fertilizer. Go and get your best practice for agronomy, your best practice for genetics on your farm, all of that. And you can start there, because that will drop your emissions intensity numbers substantially. Erin asked, how do you envisage the emission intensity values farm coming into play for grain products before it becomes a mandatory compliance step? Is there a price difference for low grain? Look, you could point to a couple of things there. One, Cargill are already offering incentives for low emissions intensity product. That the Cargill project is up and running. Ben, I forget Ben's name, Ben Fargo, came to see me about it a while back. We do have the canola report, for example, which gave priority access to Western Australian grains into the EU market because of its deemed low emissions intensity. Well, actually low emissions, not emissions intensity specifically. But we already have examples of where Western Australian canola is deemed to be one of the lowest emissions in the world. So it's starting very slowly. We thought, well, neighboring countries might not care, until the Indonesian Bread Makers Association approached us and said, where do we buy the lowest emissions intensity grain from the Australian grains industry? So even at that level, it's being seriously considered. Grains is a bit more complicated in that it's a bulk commodity, so it's not quite as differentiated once it's in the hold of a ship. But I do think grains might need to get together as collectives and say, the low rainfall Western Australian grains industry can all market itself as an average of 0.2 on the world market, and the high rainfall as 0.4 or something like that. Differentiating as an individual farmer might be a little more difficult. Look, Greg, that FAO tool that's been promoted, there's this problem we face between universal methodology and individual country methodology. I suspect it's something that's coming, in that the IPCC has approved a methodology for Australia, but it hasn't approved that method for the US, or they've got a different method approved based on their local research. So on the understanding that soils operate differently in different environments, each country has to justify its own numbers. I would say that the FAO tool will align with the framework by which carbon is accounted, but not the actual emission factors that are relevant to Australia. See, what we wouldn't want is to be judged by the FAO tool that says the emission factor for Western Australian grains is 1%, because that's where we were 25 years ago. We don't want a universal factor. We actually want to be justified by our research that we did in Western Australia through the UWA and Louise Barton's work that showed that it was lower emissions than the global standard. So I think we'd want to be careful about taking a universal methodology, because I think it would, in many cases in Australia with our low rainfall, it would penalise us rather than help us. Georgina, the baseline. There's a bit of debate around baselines at the moment. If the major banks we're working with are assuming that if they can order 10% of a particular farming population in a particular region, that subsample will give them an average number that says Western Australian grains or Northeast Victorian grains are 0.5, with a standard deviation of 1% either way. For example, that database has drawn a normal distribution of livestock producers in Western Queensland and come up with 15 is the average, but it can go from 10 to 18 as the normal distribution. So that means that when you rubber bank and you want to prioritize a customer, they would have to be 15 or better in order to meet, or in order to to help Rabobank towards their target. We have no idea how this is really going to play out in reality, but it's just that's the kind of thing that's happening at the moment is people thinking through how do we get a baseline? Is the baseline a farm baseline? Well, if you're a winery selling carbon neutral wine, it might be. But if you're a grain producer in a region, it might be the regional average. For example, someone repeating the regional assessment that Larissa did, do 100 farms in Western Australia and segregate them into low and high rainfall or into whatever populations fall out, and that becomes the baseline. Probably better to do it that way. But I would also say it depends on the rotation in the industry. If it's dairy, you'd say 5 years of dairy is plenty. If it's crop rotation, it might take you 5 years to get through one crop rotation. So that hasn't been settled yet. What we tend to do in the model is say, if you're a cropping industry, you can either do your full rotation in 5 columns in the model. In other words, you've got a pasture rotation in the first column, your legume, your pulse crop, and then your wheat and barley in all simultaneously to get one number that is representative of 5 years average, or you do the model 5 times, which seems laborious to do that, but it'll give you the same number in the end. So just to finish the second one of Georgina's comment, what happens if you turn cropping country into pastures in the previous years? Yeah, look, if it's outside of your, if you're doing an audit from 2025 through to 2030, that would be history. You would get the benefit of those pastures through a better soil carbon history, but your soil carbon will probably be going backwards into the 5 years of cropping, unless you go back to pasture. But pasture isn't actually always the solution, because when you rotate into pasture, there's animals involved. So suddenly you've got a methane signal you didn't have before. And if you're doing it on an ABN basis, you might find that you've just got to assume that that pasture is that bunch of sheep are rotating around the property through your crop rotations. So they're a constant in your operation. So yeah, Belinda, I have no idea how banks and businesses, I know personally from talking to them and working with them on their data that they're struggling with that exact concept. And it might well be that the national standard that comes out of government recommends how this should work, because in the end, we can't have individual businesses doing their own thing if there's a penalty associated with the greenhouse gas account. So this is a reality check the number of countries have had. I was in New Zealand recently where they woke up to it suddenly and said, we've got to have a government standard because we're placing a price on this, and we've kind of got a situation where the private sector is determining the methodology and people could pick and choose which method they want. So you can't have that. The moment there's a penalty or some form of restriction associated with that number, it has to be a government methodology like the Australian Tax Office. Can't have KPMG decide the method. Yeah, exactly. That last comment was exact. I do a fair bit of work with JBS, and they have a whole framework inside the business by which they do that accounting, and they are getting regional averages. I've walked them through a number of those on how methodology should work, and you know, if your population in a region is greater than 100, well, you can do 100 audits and actually get a reasonable, statistically meaningful average, median value. If your population is below 100, well, you probably have to sample them all. But it comes back to Belinda's point. It's not that easy. Greg, the government standard will probably be around by November. They've had 3 meetings already, and there's one next Thursday again. Fairly broad consultation, so the major consultancy firms are there, the JBSs, the Rabobanks are all sitting at the table. So pretty sure that when Minister Murray Watts announced it, so I met with Murray Watts about 18 months ago and put it on the table and said, this is an imperative. You can't go forward with policy until you've got an accepted method. So he commissioned that straight away, and yeah, it's a standard on accepted carbon calculation methodology and inclusions. The ACE, what are the acronym I had for it? Australian Carbon Standard. Now, it's the word standard will always appear in inverted commas because, strictly speaking, a standard applies to an ISO methodology, ISO standards. This is not a standard. It's a government determined framework, is probably a way of putting it. The standard sort of puts it up to a level that it's probably not designed to meet, because there is still going to be some need for flexibility, because not every supply chain requires the same type of reporting. So when you work with Rabobank in the Netherlands, they ask different questions to what a Texas feedlot is asking. So there are nuances within every supply chain. Yeah, Aaron, let's have a chat about the supply shed. So let me give you a tangible example, one that we're working with at the moment. So you've got a big cattle company in Northern Australia. I mentioned AACO. Let's take them as an example. They would have run the herd methodology and savanna burning methodology, and they'd have a few million carbon credits potentially available to sell to the mining giants. Times $35 a ton, that's a big number. But now suddenly you've got JBS knocking on the door saying, we'd like to buy low emissions meat from you. And they're saying, well, the only way we can do that is to not sell those carbon credits, but to inset them in as a discount on our emissions that we send you. So instead of being a 15 tons of emissions per ton of live weight, they're now deemed to be a 10 or a 5, which makes them a very attractive purchase towards JBS's target. But guess who banks both of them? It's Rabobank. So now you've got Rabo knocking at the door saying, let me in because I want to share that 30% because your 30% is my 30%. They all have the same 30% and it's the same farm. It's the same group of suppliers. So that codependency has been missing in action. These value chain players haven't faced the reality that their 30% is the same 30% as the other person's 30%. These are overlapping claims. They're not additive. So now suddenly you've got another interested party that can share the cost. So instead of JBS having to pay the full $35 a ton for the low emissions, now you've got Rabo coming along saying, well, we'll offer an interest rate reduction. They put that into the supply shed pot. And then along comes Coles wanting carbon neutral meat. Well, they would buy the inset because it's cheaper than buying carbon credits. So they put something into the pot. They might put 1,000 methane vaccines into the pot. And someone smarter than me has to then value that pot and say, well, okay, now you've got Coles, you've got McDonald's. McDonald's actually wants to buy the rest of the carcass from someone, but doesn't have a relationship with the farm. So they want to come into the relationship and pay for the rest of the carcass that they can't get otherwise at low emissions. So now suddenly you've got this consortium, each willing to pay a small amount, but not the full amount. And some of my colleagues actually did a calculation that said, do you realize if it all works according to plan at $35 a ton for the inset, it might only cost JBS 4 cents a kilo live weight. And when you look at it, you think, well, 4 cents a kilo live weight is within the standard deviation of seasonal price fluctuations. So actually, this has given us a bit of a window for the first time into who pays, because up until now, we've assumed the farmer will just pay or the consumer will just pay, but the supply chain doesn't want to pay. Now, suddenly we see a little bit of an opening of the door. Actually, if we all shared a little bit of the pain and realized our codependency, we might actually be able to get there. But now it's different if you're in grains because the commodity is different. So they've got to have their own conversation because it's not red meat. It's something different. The number is lower, but the number is more distributed. So hopefully that gives you some insight. It's very early days. This is something that's just emerging. There's a question around how would you explain the concept of scope 3 emissions and the potential for double counting? Yeah, look, double counting will solve itself, I think, because if you are CSBP, for example, the fertilizer company in Western Australia, and you are doing a report on your scope 3 emissions, they are the same scope 3 emissions that the farmer has to report on in their accounting. Now, they would want to pass that on to the farmer, so they do in the way they do their accounting. But in the end, they both want to get it to zero. And so by starting the conversation, you will force only one to take account. If you're a farmer and you're copying the load for that, you'd go back to CSBP and say, hang on, why don't you take responsibility for your emissions of your product? And CSBP would currently say, well, you bought it. But over time, only one of them will take account of it. That's I might be naive in that, but the way carbon accounting works, it has a natural incentive not to double count. Because nobody wants to cop the extra accounting. But this is a conversation people haven't had yet. So it's got to happen fairly rapidly that this has got to be sorted out. You see, we put it in our calculators deliberately, because then what happened straight away is a beef producer in Victoria was buying steers to finish off and wanted to be carbon neutral. And I presented the unfortunate that they would inherit the emissions of the beef they bought unless they bought from a carbon neutral supplier. So they just went straight to Jigsaw Farms and bought carbon neutral beef. So suddenly they can raise, they don't take responsibility for the emissions because Mark took responsibility for that. So I realize it's a long day, and questions do seem to be ending, but feel free to send through more questions. Did anyone get the Dropbox to work, or was that generally not working and I need to get Melbourne Uni to send it out to everyone? Is there anyone who didn't get it to work? Okay. Let me pop my, okay, let me put an email address in there. So probably, I don't know how Melbourne Uni are working here, but that's probably the easiest to just send me a direct email. If you have a question or you want me to send you maybe a OneDrive link or so. It's just that these are 64 megabytes big, so you can't just email it. So if it doesn't work for you, send me a direct email and I'll send you a OneDrive link or a Dropbox, a different type of link. Okay, all right. Great, well, thank you, everybody. Hopefully that was clear and you can get what you need out of it. But if you don't, please come back to me and we can